start at 8:45, is that right? 8:45. Okay.
New batteries. We'll make sure we're all wired up and ready to go. Huh? Okay.
Check. Check 1, 2. Test. Testing. It's better. Check.
Okay, so they said that you gave him 2 hours worth of questions to work on. Man, how you doing? Great to see you. Great to see you. Oh, thanks. Same to you.
Yeah, how are you? Yes, nice to see you.
I saw Mr. Dolan earlier this morning.
We're
So,
all here. Yes, well, Bob.
well, what happened was Robin? They said.
Liver cancer.
Well, I sure am sorry to see it. You can tell how much we missed each other. Glad you guys are here.
That's right. I don't expect it.
It's crazy. It's always crazy.
I spent a lot of time up there, but
Well, it's just there's always something to do. I'm going to ask a technology question. If I sit here, the question is, can I advance my PowerPoint?
Okay.
Let's see. Hey.
do we still use have to point this in this direction?
Because I don't know, depending upon, just going to have to see what Ruth covers, and I'm just going to have to skip around a little bit,
Yeah.
depending upon what's already been covered, so we don't say the same thing. And I think that Ken and Carrie and Jim are all real excited.
They do seem like
They
that.
are.
So that's a good thing. So
How did you identify them?
uh,
Or did you know
Jim
them already?
Jim made the suggestion on the questionnaire responses from last year
Right,
that we engage the audience
right,
in
okay,
some
that
of
was
these
him,
discussions.
okay.
So Jim got that idea planted.
Okay,
I knew Ken,
Okay.
knew some of the things he was doing,
okay,
and then we inquired around to various people, and a number of them turned us down. But then they knew Carrie, down in Denver, the work she'd done, and she said, yeah, she's going to.
and she's really, because it's Colorado, so I think that's a nice thing. Good.
Right. Okay.
Okay, do you guys have the day? I need to give you the day of the next Georgetown conference. Do you have that day already written down?
I don't know that I do.
Last year.
You make it.
Do we give up, do we need to step down from the panel?
Yeah. Right. You agree.
Do what?
Pick your cards up and you go down here. These three guys are going to come up here.
Okay, so we'll just go sit in there.
So you can just
Good. See you. So you couldn't be with us?
I know, you know what? I got it super early.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. You're saying the same thing?
So I started figuring out how to cut it out when I got to read that. So I'm just going to, she says, say goodnight.
And really, I mean, these guys are part of it.
Yeah. They are.
So this is for the. Yes, okay. So you and I will go down there.
Ruth and I. If we want Ruth. I mean, okay, Ruth's part of the panel.
Yeah, she.
Okay, so we'll just go sit.
Okay. We're going to think we're doing the voting.
We'll have to sulk.
I'll try to
We'll
make
slink
sure.
away. Ruth, our tail
Since you
between
guys
our
don't
legs.
know anything
Do you
about
know?
Okay. Good morning. How are you? Yeah, right. Good.
probably ought to have a little chat with you. You may wonder why I asked you that question about passing the information along to the trustees. Have you gotten much of a reaction from them?
Yes. Nothing negative.
Really? Okay, well that's good.
Yeah, nothing negative. There's a meeting scheduled October 11th. Okay. So they'll deal with it then. But I've heard nothing negative at all yet. And if I were going to, I think I would heard the meeting.
See, I was afraid maybe the numbers were too low.
I think they'll end up going between mid-grade and high-range. Probably not even go all the way to the highest. Probably maybe three-quarters way out.
Or you could go back to OCG and ask them to beef up this executive trustee piece.
Right.
I started to fiddle with that, and I thought, you know, I wrote a lot of this report.
I can tell.
But it's the law part. And I have no business writing their professional part. So if you guys want to push back, you should.
I'll find out. I will find out from them. Well, I might even. Coach Ron was going to be meeting with one of the accountants on something, I think maybe tomorrow. So I might.
Okay.
Yeah, they're just, it's really good news because they're pretty much be able to move $50 million.
Yeah, that's going to be good. All right, well,
Okay,
I get to
yeah.
work, but
Yeah.
we'll talk later.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks.
A couple of those up there. That up there.
Did everybody? Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call us to order. Looks like we have a few empty seats, but I'm sure folks will be showing up shortly. All right, well, good morning. Welcome to Colorado Springs, for those of you who are from out of town. I'm Jim Hassan, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you here to the Rocky Mountain Tax Seminar. I have the opportunity to ask hard questions of all my esteemed panelists up here, try to give them a hard time as we go through all of this. A prior Attorney General of the state of New York, back in the 1850s, a fellow by the name of John Van Buren, is attributed with creating the phrase vote early and vote often, which has been used, of course, by generations of politicians ever since. But it applies to this group because you guys all voted early by practically selling out our seminar by May of this year, and you voted often by having many more people wanting to come than we had set as the ceiling for attendance. We had concluded that we really didn't want to have more than about 125 people so that we could all fit comfortably in the facility and see the video screen and so forth. But we had so many folks wanting to come that we got up to about 165. And so in response to that, our wonderful hosts and sponsor, elpomarfoundation, has significantly upgraded our audio visuals that I hope are going to be of benefit to all of us, and particularly to you. We've got a screen here that's so large it's frightening to think of. So we really thank you for your support in being here. Now let me see a show of hands of those of you who are here for the first time. Okay, super. We really are delighted to have you here. Those of you sitting around the folks that are here for the first time, make a special effort to introduce yourself, let them know how to find their way around, and give them more insight as to what's going on during the seminar. One of the real benefits, I believe, of this gathering is the opportunity for those of us in the foundation community to get to know our peers, get to know others in foundations in different geographic areas, in different fields of interest, and to be able to share that experience and learn from it. So delighted to have both the returning folks as well as those of you who are new. Now, as I mentioned, El Pomar is our wonderful sponsor. The El Pomar Foundation makes the facilities here available to us for the seminar. They're the sponsors for the seminar. They were the ones that enabled us to come here and start the seminar some 9 years ago. So we very much appreciate all of the trustees and staff of El Pomar. I think we have a number of them number of their trustees and staff who are here or who will be here during other parts of the program. We have Bill Hibble, who is the chair and CEO of the El Pomar Foundation. We have Kyle Hibble, who's the chief operating officer and general counsel for both the El Pomar Foundation and the Broadmoor, and who will be one of our host speakers. We have Thayer Tutt often is here. Is Thayer here this morning? Don't see Thayer, but he will likely show up. He's the chief investment officer for El Pomar. Are there other trustees of El Pomar that are here? Let's see a show of hands. Anybody that's here? Well, if not, they will be around, so hopefully you'll get a chance to express your appreciation to them. And then the real people that make this seminar a reality are the staff of El Pomar, headed up by Nicole Magic Soto, young lady over here by the door in the white blouse. She deserves her middle name for sure, that of Magic. She accomplishes wonderful logistics over and over and over again to make all of this happen. She is assisted by the younger Nicole Pellegrino. I said that because she's holding her son. My goodness, you know, she's got. Here's the newest member of the sporting staff, and that's Henry over here with. Nicole Pellegrino had to miss our program last year because Henry was making his appearance. But we're delighted to have both of them in person this year. And then we have Phil. Phil's around somewhere making sure everything is working wonderfully. Jeff and JJ, responsible for all of our wonderful audio visuals, both installation and operation to keep all of this running effectively. So, and other folks on the elpomar staff and support group, we really appreciate everything that you do. Then the next set of thanks go to the outstanding faculty. We know that the only reason you come here is to hear the faculty. The hospitality of the Broadmoor, the beauty of the surroundings, you know, the weather, have nothing to do with it, of course. It's all the faculty, but you those of you who've been here before know that present company accepted, these are the best people, the best lawyers working in the private foundation field in the country, and they volunteer their time to be here with us. Bruce Hopkins, Virginia Gross, Celia Rohde, and Ruth Madrigal. They're absolutely wonderful, and those of you that have not heard them before have a real treat in store for you. They not only are here for the program, but they all actively participate in the planning of the program, the preparation of the materials, and the organization for how we're going to run the seminar, and then, of course, the execution here this time. I also want to extend special thanks to two folks who are not with us today. We hope maybe we'll see one of them later on in the week. I'll call them the godfathers of this seminar here in Colorado Springs, and that's Rob Hilbert, formerly with the elpomar Foundation, and Jerry Dickman of the Chapman Charitable Trust of Tulsa and here in Colorado Springs. Both of them are unfortunately having encounters with the medical profession. They would just as soon be here rather than dealing with physicians. But unfortunately, both of them will miss us this year. We owe them a great debt of gratitude for persuading the elpomar and the other folks involved to get the seminar established here. For those of you that have not been here, one of the key elements of the seminar is our audience interaction sessions after lunch. That will be after lunch today and tomorrow, and then at the very end of the morning program on Friday. Those of you who are new, we very much want you to participate actively in those sessions. We know the temptations of the tennis courts and the golf courses and so forth are out there, but I think you'll find the opportunity for questions, responses, comments, back and forth between the panel and the audience would be of great interest and value to you. We ask you to write out questions. You've got a notepad. Jot down your questions as they occur to you. Give them to any of us or put them up here on the front table, and we will address your questions during those sessions after lunch today and the other days. So with that, Nicole, could you come up here and give folks some further logistical information?
Good morning. On behalf of El Pomar and its trustees, I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you for taking the time out of the next 2.5 days to be in beautiful Colorado Springs and enjoying the seminar. As you can see, we have a few upgrades if you've been here before. A lot of you think it's actually a bigger facility. It's not. We just put a lot more people in here. So we do have the glass sides now, and so hopefully it doesn't distract you too much when we have the animals come by and you're looking out the windows. We do have a second layer above us, so if it rains, we are safe and sound and it's quiet. And you'll notice, maybe you don't, that our air conditioning's on right now and you don't hear it. So heat and AC, it's practically silent. So we've had a few upgrades, and including this small screen. So even if you're way in the back, hopefully you can see the screen rather well. Another upgrade, we are live streaming this for the very, very first time. The funny story of that is one of my bosses told me this would be a really great idea for the seminar, right, Elaine? And I said, no. I have too many other things to worry about than adding live streaming to what we do. But an attendee asked me to live stream, and I said, yes. So I confessed that to Elaine a few days ago. I said, I'm sorry, my boss, but an attendee asked me, and I'm like, sure, we'll make it happen. So we do have 2 attendees actually watching this via live stream. We're testing out this year to see how it works. So we might be able to offer that in future years and when we're sold out. I had to turn away 10 people this year, which absolutely breaks my heart that I had to do that. So hopefully live streaming will be the next best thing in the 21st century, and we'll be able to offer that for future. So that's a lot of cameras up here and a lot of screens, but hopefully this will be a good experience for everybody. Jim had mentioned that about thank yous, and really it's not just me that puts this event on. It takes a big team of people who are dedicated and passionate about this program. And it really is. We have the Penrose House staff that you saw down at breakfast. We have the facilities gentlemen, Phil and Jared, who are going, you'll see them quite a bit. We have Holton AV, who is here, and they spend the entire time listening to everything and making sure the AV runs perfectly. And so it really takes a huge team to make this happen, and I'm grateful to be a part of that team. But one person in particular, and Jim had mentioned her, and that's Nicole Pellegrino. I was devastated to lose her last year, 20 days before the seminar started, but that cute little one that she's holding really doesn't make me upset anymore. So Nicole has been wonderful by working side by side on the seminar. She does it remotely from home, actually, and then spends the next 2.5 days with all of us. So Nicole, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your dedication and keeping me on track, which is a full-time job. So thank you very much, Nicole. So just a few logistics. We have a little bit of extra substance. We have so many people here. If you haven't been here, our restrooms, it's called the Tea House, which is right out here. You can see it through the windows. That is your restroom area. And the breakfast time will always be in the main dining room, which is the main house, and you can sit outside in the courtyard there. At lunchtime, since we all go to lunch at the same time, we do have additional seating here under the tent. Everybody loves to sit outside, and we're going to have some pretty impeccable weather these next couple of days. And so there's outdoor seating here for 48. There will also be a buffet up here, so you don't have to go down to the house, get your lunch, and come back up. So we're trying to make it as convenient as possible to make sure everybody has lunch at the same time. So like I said, the main dining room, there's a small dining room, the courtyard, and this area here for lunch. So if you need anything or have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We do have gluten-free items, vegetarian items. We will make sure we can accommodate any dietary restrictions that you have. A couple other things. Your electronic book should have been emailed to you on Monday, along with an attendee list. Of course, when I try to do an attendee list early, it's wrong. So the new attendee list is in front of you in paper format. There were a few errors I had made, and so we have new ones in front of you. Some titles I had incorrect. If you did not get your electronic book, please let me know. Give me your business card, and I will get that resent to you. I already have one that didn't get it, so just let me know if you need that. CPE and CLE credits. So we do have 13.5 CPE credits, and we have 11 CLE credits with 1 ethics this year. Thank you, Virginia. And so I have those forms. I usually give them out on Friday once the seminar is completed, but if you're not going to be here Friday, please come back and we'll get those forms to you before you leave on Thursday. If you need a letter of attendance, I know many times it's great to have that attached to your application for your credits. I'm happy to print one out for you. Leave me your business card, and then I will leave the completed letters on the table for you to pick up at your convenience. And I'll do that on Thursday afternoon when you've been here, because I know a lot will have to leave on Friday for travel. So if you need any of those documents, just please come back and see Nicole or I. Same names. It's going to be really easy for you to remember us. Couple things. We have power strips in the very back of the room. There's also the snacks in the back of the room. Every snack that you can possibly imagine is back there for you. Tonight we have our welcome reception and dinner at the Shine Mountain Zoo. Many of you have RSVP'd that you're coming, so thank you for joining us tonight. We do have the shuttles leaving Broadmoor West at 5:30 and 5:45. They're the huge Cheyenne Mountain Zoo shuttles, so we can put a lot of people on there. And they'll take you to the front of the zoo. And we do have our reception in the giraffe exhibit, which you can actually feed the giraffe tonight, which is always a fun thing to do. And then you can either walk or you can take the shuttle up to the Moose Lodge, which where our dinner is located. We will start, the buffet will open at 6:45. We'll start our program, welcome remarks, about 7. And Chris Lydell, who is our new CEO of our newly being built right now, Olympic Museum, will be our guest speaker this evening. So we have the joyous pleasure of having an Olympic Museum in our city that opens next year. So we thought it'd be great to hear from him and the progress that's happening and how foundations have made that happen for our city. So it'll be a good night for that. See if I'm missing anything else. I guess last but not least, if there is anything you absolutely need, whether it's something with the hotel, the house, the seminar, travel, please come back and see Nicole or I. We're happy to help you in any way that we can to make sure your stay here is as nice as it can be. And I really appreciate from all my heart all of you being here with us today. And our new people, thank you for trusting us that this is going to be a seminar that you need, and we will not let you down. So with that, our speaker, Jim.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, this morning we're launching on a new experiment. Those of you who have been here in the past know that we have ordinarily had our keynote speaker as a guest speaker coming to us from the government, either current government employee or someone who has just recently left government service. But as we started thinking about the program this year, we reflected on the tremendous reception that you, the audience, gave to us last year around the topic of impact investing or mission-related investing. And there were multiple requests on your questionnaire responses after the seminar last year to have more information about this type of activity of private foundations. So we started thinking about, well, how do we do that? How do we avoid duplicating what we did last year? How do we integrate government speaker with that? And then the obvious thought occurred to us, and that is we already have the greatest former government speaker on our faculty, Ruth Madrigal. Ruth Madrigal was at the Treasury Department and she was the driving force behind the new regulations dealing with program-related investing and expanding on that into mission-related investing. So we said, well, heck, we don't need to find anybody else. There's nobody better than Ruth that could talk about that. Well, we also had requests from the questionnaire responses last year. Why don't we see if we could engage more of the audience in discussions of the topic? So we put out a call for help, and we came up with 3 great volunteers, former attendees, folks who have attended prior sessions. And so they're going to make up a panel that's going to follow Ruth's comments. And then that panel, together with Celia Rohde, are going to talk about some of the more technical aspects of program-related investing, impact investing, and so forth. So all of the biographical information about Ruth and the other faculty members, about our volunteer panel, are, I think, in tab 2 of the big book, probably in at least some of the information in the small brochures. So with that, Ruth, the podium is yours.
Okay, good morning. As some of you may know, when I was in the government, which was for 6 years, I was not allowed to do PowerPoints or handouts, and so Jim is intent on testing my hand-eye-body coordination by not only having me do PowerPoints, but stand and read notes and try to keep track of time. So when I fail at one or the other, it's okay to laugh. I'm here to talk today about the green light for impact investing. Why, how did the government seem to go, yeah, go ahead, do impact investing, with the issuance of guidance, the program-related regulations, and another notice about mission-related investing. Why, how did that come about? Because there has certainly been a significant increase in talk about impact investing over the last decade. I was in private practice for a decade before I went to Treasury, and I was hearing a little bit. I've been interested in the topic since before I went to law school, because I saw some efficiencies in the commercial and business world that sometimes were not evident in the nonprofit sector. And so there were some folks playing around with the idea of commercial methods for charitable purposes way back years, a couple of decades ago, far back. But when I had a Google search set up at Treasury about impact investing, now back in 2010, 11, I would get a hit and a delivery maybe once every couple of weeks. There might be a couple of things come out, and that may be because our library services were not quite as good as they are now in my private role, but I'm now getting hits every day. Lots and lots of hits, lots and lots of talk about impact investing. So I'm going to talk today a little bit. I'm going to start out with just a definition. I don't assume that you all know what it is. I'm going to talk a little bit about what impact investing covers and what it is, and how it came to be that the Treasury Department and IRS issued guidance here effectively saying, yeah, private foundations, go out there and look at this area. And that was a key intent in issuing this guidance. So just to start, what is impact investing? Okay, this is a definition. It is not the definition. There are lots and lots of definitions out there, and I find it difficult to keep up with them all. So I have come up with a picture, because I draw pictures to help me understand things that get complicated. And I find that the term impact investing covers a whole range of activities that the key parts of this definition are investments, blah, 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 generate measurable social, environmental impact, blah, blah, financial return. All of the definitions have the same couple of elements: financial return, social return, and an investment form. And that covers a wide range of activities that span sort of the gap between the two traditional private foundation silos. You know the silos, right? You got the program staff that sit over here, you got the investing staff that sit over here, usually different floors, maybe a different corner. They don't talk to each other much. Because the grant-making folks, they feel like we're doing the charitable mission of the foundation. We are giving away the money. We are doing charitable stuff by giving grants. And the investment folks are over here saying, well, we're doing the charitable mission of the foundation. We are making the money that those guys can give away. And they're both right. Those are the two functions that make philanthropy sort of happen, right? Generating assets and giving them away. But in the middle, there is a range of tools that can be used to also further the charitable mission of the foundation. So impact investing spans this space. And there are different buckets that have been sort of staked out in the middle. Program-related investments, sometimes abbreviated PRIs, mission-related investments, MRIs, sustainable investing, SRI, and the boundaries are fluid. And depending on who's talking to you, whether they're from the investment side or from the grant side, and there's a lot of argument. I'm not going to get into the argument much. I'm going to talk about from the policy perspective. When I joined Treasury in 2010, it was all sort of a mishmash, and we're trying to sort it out under this big umbrella. But we're going to need some definitions first, so we'll start with Section 4944. This is not a new section. This came into the code in 1969, and it basically imposes an excise tax on jeopardizing investments. Those are investments that jeopardize the carrying out of a private foundation's charitable purposes. So typically, it's one where the managers did not use ordinary business care and prudence when they made the investment, and they can be subject to tax as well as the private foundation. And typically, this is one of those really bad investments. You don't see them a lot out there. There's not a lot of rulings that involve just Section 4944 jeopardizing investments. Often they come coupled with self-dealing. That's where you'll see a lot of them. But even in that statute, even back in 1969, there was a carve-out, and program-related investments were going on even back then. And there's a special carve-out in the statute that says that program-related investments are not jeopardizing investments. They may not be really winners from a financial standpoint, and in fact, they can't. The purpose can't be making money. There are 3 prongs of the test for a program-related investment, or PRI. The primary purpose has to be to accomplish a charitable purpose of the foundation. Second prong is that no significant purpose is financial profit, either production of income or appreciation of property. That's how the statute says it. And then the regulations add that no purpose is lobbying or participation in political campaigns. I throw that out there just because I have to. Usually that's not an issue when you're talking about these kinds of investments. You make this determination at the time you're presented with the investment. And if it meets these 3 prongs, then it is essentially treated for federal tax purposes like a grant equivalent. You can count it as part of your 5% minimum distribution, and it's exempt from the excess business holdings rules in 4943. It's not considered a jeopardizing investment because the primary purpose is to further your charitable purposes, not to jeopardize them. Still, self-dealing rules apply, expenditure responsibility rules apply, and I think Celia will talk a lot more about the practical aspects of making PRIs, because I want to get to the how did this come about, how did we get here part of this discussion. I'll just give you a few examples, though, of PRIs. They're in your materials. I'm not going to read them to you, but one example, for example, is a below-market loan to minority business owner in a distressed community to help this distressed community. Note that in that example, in the regs, it says that the investment will qualify as a PRI even though the private foundation may earn income comparable to or more than a conventional portfolio. Why? Because there's risk involved here. And in general, if you're making a loan, a below market loan to a minority business owner in a distressed community where it's not likely to succeed, the chances are really high he's not going to pay you back. And that's sort of why the tax law treats it as a grant from the beginning, because the likelihood of this thing coming back to you is very small. The likelihood is this is going to be a grant in the end. And if it doesn't, if it ends up that he actually pays you back the loan, well, then it's treated just like a grant coming back to you. And you have to turn around and push it back out in your next year's qualifying distributions. So another example is a low-interest loan, again, in a distressed area to a nonprofit organization that's doing economic development. And it notes in this example that the reason they want a PRI here is that banks are refusing to lend to this community economic development agency unless it has more equity capital. Okay, so if the PF lends, then they won't unless there's, unless the private foundation loans. I'm getting ahead of myself. So if the private foundation loans, banks will loan also. Oops. Whoa. The next one is a low interest loan in the distressed area. Again, this is another below market loan, but it's not to low income folks or minorities, but it's to a business that employs a substantial number of low income persons. And the below market rate is for loans of comparable risk. And so it makes a note that this is a risk adjusted. I want to point that out. It's a risk-adjusted rate of return. We're not talking about absolute rates of return here, because oftentimes the real hallmark of a PRI is you're going into a situation where other lenders and other investors will not go, and it's going to be very, very risky. The next example I'm going to highlight is an equity investment in a small business enterprise owned by economically disadvantaged minority group. They can't get loans unless they have more equity capital. So here again we have the notion that a program-related investment coming in and making this highly risky equity investment will also unlock some capital for this organization from commercially minded investors. The next slide, I just want to flag, there's a mistake in the title. It shouldn't be equity investment, it should be a low interest loan to a public company to induce them to build a new factory in an economically depressed area. So you're getting a sense. These are the examples that were originally there. And one thing you'll notice, they all kind of sound the same, right? There's debt, there's equity, but it's all about economic development in a low-income community, distressed, minority-owned businesses. This is what the 10 examples in the regulations that were promulgated in 72, 73, that's what they looked like. Because that was the state of the program-related investment market at that time. There were just a few organizations doing it, and this is what the state of the art was in the late 1960s. However, the market has changed since the late 1960s. The type of investments the whole country is making across sectors has changed. And so back in 2002, this is a timeline, and this is where sort of, I was looking back at my notes from last year, and I was talking about how the charitable sector can be an active partner with the policy-making bodies and with the IRS and Treasury in making the policy and the rules that you all live under. And I used as my example the program-related investing guidance and was showing the points where the sector and the government were sort of both providing input. And this is a great example of that. Like I noted last year, in 2002, the ABA section on taxation, with lots of input from private foundations in this space, said, hey, those regs from 1972, they don't reflect the current state of the market. And while we're trying to tell people that this is a really good tool for accomplishing charitable purposes, a lot of folks look at these examples and say, yeah, that's not my program area. I like the arts, or I'm doing things overseas, and I don't see the things I want to do in those examples. Can you give us some more examples? And nothing. There was no, basically there was not a lot happening between 2002 and 2010, but in 2010, the ABA tax section re-upped their request. And so what is different? You'll see in the little abbreviated timeline, within 9 months it was on the priority guidance plan, which is the list of things that are going to be a top priority to do guidance on. And just a little, just within 2 years, there were proposed regulations out. So that's a pretty quick timeline. So what's the difference? Well, little thing in 2008 came along, and that changed a lot of things. I think in 2010, when I joined Treasury, we were in the thick of a very difficult time that was hitting across the country in all sectors, and the charitable sector was feeling the pinch too, because there was a lot of charitable need and no more charitable assets. The charitable assets in private foundations took a hit just like everybody else. And there was a real need to try to figure out, how can we address more needs? How can we be more efficient with what we've got? How can we leverage our resources to pull more resources to charitable work? And that was a real priority, and a working group formed at the Office of Social Innovation in the White House to talk about these things across multiple agencies. And I was the Treasury participant. There were participants from the Department of Energy, from HUD, from all kinds of different organizations across the board. And I found out that there's a lot of ways in which private foundations touch policy in a number of areas: transportation, housing, foreign policy. The State Department was represented. Energy policy and sustainable energy and energy efficiency and the environment are sort of obvious, but there were a lot of ways in which these different agencies were having interactions with private foundations and finding that private foundations were having a hard time sometimes partnering and bringing together the critical mass of capital to be able to do impactful projects seemed to be a real problem. So one thing that kept coming up in listening sessions in the interagency working group, and then also this from the sector, is you should look at program-related investments and the barrier that the current guidance can be to foundations getting involved here. The other barrier, quite frankly, was that a lot of private foundations just didn't even know that this existed. That's also a barrier. It's a real barrier. It's not a legal barrier, but it was still a major barrier because a lot of folks had never heard of program-related investments. So the idea came up both from the ABA and internally: why doesn't Treasury do some guidance to clarify what private foundations can do that would have the benefit not only of doing some legal clarification, but actually raising the profile of this topic so that people could start to talk about it and learn from each other about it, and have me as the Treasury representative run around the country and talk about it, and by doing that might educate the sector and bring some more attention to this area so that it could develop. So why do PRI guidance was the question that was coming back to us from the purely legal folks at IRS, and from the folks that, quite frankly, are charged with a difficult task of administering the code. PRIs have been around for a long time, and foundations know how to do them, and there's guidance out there. Why should we waste our limited resources? Well, the answer, as I just mentioned, was most people don't know they're there, and the regs may be there, but people aren't reading the regs on a regular basis. There's a real concern, I think, on their part that liberalizing the rules could result in abuse or private benefit. There has been a long-standing project to look at the co-investment between private foundations and their disqualified persons, and a little discomfort that while in some cases, and there's a number of rulings out there saying, well, it's okay, that in some other cases, they're not really quite so comfortable, and I'm glad there's a panel on that later this week. Joint ventures, flat out, are scary to the IRS. They really have a hard time looking at joint ventures and figuring out what's okay and what's not, and the potential for private benefits scares them silly. And liberalizing the rules, they fear, would give you all license, and since you're such a crazy bunch of folks that you'll go out there and make these crazy investments, they were a little bit concerned that charitable assets would be dissipated. But why do it? And this was from the policy side at Treasury, looking at the bigger picture. Well, y'all need more tools, and particularly post-2008. Having a range of tools could be very helpful. And PRIs were underutilized because of the lack of knowledge. I noted uncertainty about when they worked and when they didn't, and the high transaction costs, and proposed regulations could help address some of that. And a high priority was economic development, still is, jobs. I mean, that is really still a concern, even to this day. And the PRI tool works very well sometimes in situations of economic development and involving taxable organizations as well as tax exempt. Part of that policy discussion was, well, they can do grants. Isn't it good that they just give the grants? And in your materials, there's this list of why would you want to use an investment, and why would we, from a policy perspective, maybe think that investment might be better than a grant. And some of these I've noted as already noticed in the regs were things like, number 3, the investment can leverage additional capital to the work. Having a PRI come in and absorb some of the risk may induce regular investors to also come in and provide the rest of the funding, the gap funding. And there was an example that was floating around at the time of an investment where a bank wouldn't, a private foundation would come in and make a $6 million grant of a $10 million, but they needed that $4 million gap to be filled with a loan from a bank. Bank wouldn't do it, but they said, you know what, it won't meet our underwriting criteria for risk return and all, but if you will provide a guarantee of the first $2 million in loss, we'll make a $10 million loan, and that will somehow meet the underwriting criteria, the amounts and all. Well, that seemed like a really great deal. The private foundation could guarantee and at most lose $2 million, and 10 more million comes into, an even worst case scenario, 8 million comes in to make this project fly, where the project would not have happened but for the private foundation being willing to backstop first losses there. So we issued new, I mentioned the interagency desire for partnerships. We issued new proposed regulations in April of 2012. And it gave 9 new examples that were intended to sort of reduce some of the uncertainty. You can use them for various charitable purposes. You can use them outside the United States. You can use them with for-profit companies, and they can take a variety of forms, including things like loan guarantees. It didn't address questions about charitable purpose. That wasn't the purpose here. But as I was out talking to folks about the proposed regulations and the new examples, comments would come back saying, yeah, but here's the thing. There are some investments that have a lot of charitability, and we would make the PRI accept that. My lawyer tells me I can't. It has a really attractive financial profile, and I really want to make that return. It's a great return as well as charitable, and so what should I do? I thought, from a policy perspective, it's a no-brainer. You should make that investment. You can get all the charitable impact of a grant and a good, healthy return that's prudent. Why wouldn't you make that investment? And the answer was, well, the lawyer tells me I can't put it in that PRI box because I'm afraid that the return is too good. And my investment guy says, you can't make that because I'm afraid that that return is not good enough, and it's not maximizing. And this was a little troubling to hear, because those are exactly the kinds of investments that we went to all the trouble to try to encourage. So I have to introduce another concept here. If you're making investments that are not, you're not just dealing with 4944 and does it jeopardize your exempt purpose, but you're dealing with state law, state fiduciary duty law. Are you making a prudent investment, or are you being imprudent in squandering assets? And the state law basically says you have to make prudent investments. But in doing that, the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds, or MIFA, is the the major statute governing that, it excludes program-related investments. So you don't fall under UPMIFA if you've got these assets that are held primarily for program-related purposes rather than exclusively for investment. And examples that are given in some of that guidance include the house that's owned by the homeless shelter, or investing in a piece of property that's right next to the university, not because it's a great real estate investment, but because you may expand and put another building there eventually. So the program-related assets that are primarily high bar, the main purpose for holding them is your charitable purpose, they're out from under UPMIFA. That's not a bar. For all other investments, though, you have to balance, and you have to balance a variety of factors. I'm not going to go into this. I'm going to skip down to the bottom line. One of those factors can be, the last one on here, the asset's special relationship to the charitable purposes of the institution. So built into the state law balancing and prudence concept is this notion that if you've got a charitable return as well as the financial return, you can consider that. So the state of, and folks had been doing that for a long time. I'm going to mention sustainable investing. It was at the sort of the far end next to traditional investing on that little chart I showed you. There's one of many definitions there. But there had been folks for a long time alongside regular investing taking into account charitable pluses in the form of negative screens. I'm not going to invest in those things. Cancer Society doesn't invest in tobacco products. Positive screens. I am going to invest in these things that do give good returns. But always with sustainable investing, a market rate return, a prudent return, is at base with a plus of some social or environmental impact. And why would you do that? Well, because the foundation's mission is the charitable purpose. And so both the investing and the grant making or program activities should be aligned and moving in the same direction. And you certainly wouldn't want your investment activities undercutting your grant making or program activities. And last bullet, why not? What folks are starting to document, and there's research studies coming out, is that oftentimes taking into account social or environmental benefits can improve investment returns. I read an article the beginning of the year about the UBS chairman coming around and saying, I'm not getting into impact investing because I have a soft heart, but we have this fund that is looking at investing with a gender lens, and it turns out if we invest in companies that have at least 2 women on the boards, we have higher returns. So I'm all on board. I'm all about impact investing. Well, that's the sustainable end, which is more about the investment returns. But here's a picture of the landscape in 2012 as far as legally, where you knew grants were okay, and you knew program-related investments were okay, and you had new guidance there. You know traditional investing's okay. Sustainable investing, you know you're all right under UPMIFA. We're hearing some questions from some foundations about whether it's okay under 4944, whether you'd have a jeopardizing investment, because 4944 doesn't list out among the balancing factors taking into account the charitable purpose of the organization. It doesn't specifically say that in the regs. And there was this big hole in the middle for investments that were charitable, and maybe very charitable, and maybe that was a significant purpose, more than just a bonus, but they might not have hit the program-related investment requirements. Maybe it was doing good things, but not quite primarily charitable. Or maybe it was doing primarily charitable and significantly for financial return. So this was the concern, that there was this gap right where there were investments that we would want folks making. And we moved to fill that gap. In September of 2015, we issued Notice 2015-62. People call it colloquially the Mission-Related Investment Notice. I will point out, I was hesitant to use that term when I was a government speaker because it gave the IRS the willies, and they would be very unhappy with me if I said, oh yes, this is the mission-related investments notice. That term is not defined, and that's what gives them a hard time. They don't know what a mission-related investment is because it's nowhere defined in the code, and it's defined in very squishy ways other places. But as I'm the one out here speaking, it's a shorthand that folks can come to understand in the context of this sort of a chart. This is the space where the mission-related investment notice was intended to fill. And it says flat out, it's very short. It was highly led by Treasury, intended to be read not just by your GC or your outside counsel, but by your investment professionals, your CEOs, your board, to give comfort in this space and some clarity that the purpose that it recognizes for the first time that investments may have both financial and charitable purposes, but it says flat out you can consider all the relevant facts and circumstances, including the foundation's charitable purposes. And they say legally, this is sort of what the regs really meant all along. That's sort of the gist of putting it in a notice. It's sub-regulatory. They're saying it's not really a change. This is what the regulations meant. And it says that foundations are not required to only seek investments that offer the highest rates of returns, the lowest risks, or the greatest liquidity, so long as foundation managers exercise the requisite ordinary business care and prudence. And foundations may, in fact, prioritize charitable returns when they're weighing up the charitable and the financial benefits from an investment transaction. And this is guidance for 4944, seeking to fill that gap to say, yeah, you really can do the weighing. So sustainable investing, there shouldn't be a question there as to 4944. And when you get into this landscape where financial return is not your primary motive, you can balance and you can make those trade-offs. So that's the import of the mission-related investing notice. And I just put this back up there to remind you the full spectrum sort of sits there. You've got, I like to talk about impact investing as either impact investing, where you're leading with impact, and the financial return may or may not follow, and the impact investing, where the primary purpose is still financial return, and the impact may follow. The mission-related investments, it's a mix in there, but oftentimes it's helpful to keep in mind your purpose when you're going about thinking about impact investing, and really which side of the spectrum are you on. And that's another chart to help you. It sort of summarizes some of what we've been talking about. In the 5 minutes I have left, I just wanted to touch on something new. Because it's related to impact investing, and it's a new policy initiative, this time led by Congress. And in the Tax Act at the end of 2017, there was a lot in there, and a lot has gotten a lot of ink, but there was also this two new sections, 1400Z-1 and 2, that provide a new incentive to draw capital to distressed communities. The distressed communities are called qualified opportunity zones. They have been designated by the governors of the states. And the incentive, there's some terms, there's some more slides in there in your materials so you can read about it. But I wanted to flag it. The main way this works is that it provides an incentive for investors to take a gain that they have realized someplace else, like selling publicly traded shares. They've realized a gain. If they take that gain and dump it into a qualified opportunity fund, which is set up to make investments in qualified opportunity zones, the low-income communities, if they do that, then they defer tax that they would otherwise be paying on that gain. And as long as they have it sitting in that qualified opportunity fund, their tax is deferred until they reach the Cinderella date of December 31st, 2026. At that point, they recognize the gain and they pay the tax at the rate that's then in effect. But if the investor has held that QOF investment for at least 5 years, then when they recognize tax, they only recognize 90% of the gain instead of the full 100% of the gain that they deferred. And if they've held it 7 years, well, then they're only paying tax on 85% of the gain instead of the full 100. And if they hold their investment the full 10 years, recognizing gain on that investment at 2026, and then continuing to hold until they've reached a hold period of at least 10 years, then when they sell that QOF interest, that Qualified Opportunity Fund interest, there's no tax on the gain on that fund interest. So that's a pretty powerful incentive that has started to get a lot of attention, and you may hear about it. Now, what does this have to do with charities? Nothing directly. This is about making equity investments in operating businesses in qualified opportunity zones. However, why do I know about this then if I'm a charity lawyer? I was tapped to be my firm's sort of expert in this space because as it turns out, this isn't just about incentives for investors and good things for investors. The point of this is good things happening in low-income communities. The point is to try to make sure that that some of the benefit of the gains that have taken place in our economy over the last 10 years can flow into some of these hard-hit communities. And that's where you all, my people, have been working for years. There is an alignment of goal of helping these distressed communities. And so it's still being fleshed out. This is new, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But one thing I would challenge you as folks who have been operating in these communities and have special knowledge, you have a role to play. And it's not clear what that role is, but at the very least, I think probably the charitable sector has a better idea about where the investment opportunities are and what the communities need more than some of the big Wall Street banks. So there's going to be a need to identify impactful opportunities within these zones. There may be impactful programs that charities are running that could be partnered with a for-profit entity and run as an entity that could seek investment from a fund. Some of your donors that are giving to you to participate in community economic development might be interested in becoming investors in funds that are also seeking the same thing. This is a way of it's seeking these sorts of mission-driven investments from taxable individuals. So I think that there is some similarity here with the impact investing topic that we're talking about, and I just wanted to flag it for you. Thanks a lot.
Great introduction. We're going to accelerate our printed agenda a bit. We're going to take a break now for 10 minutes. Then we're going to pick back up with our panel. So we're trying to give as much time to our panel folks as we can. Be back in 10 minutes and we'll get started.
We get relegated at this point. That's right.
Made to leave.
So we just go down there.
Right. Yeah. Well, actually, we can just go there.
I guess so. And I guess we better clear space.
See if we're doing effort in the audience. Okay, we'll see if they're looking.
Hi there. Yeah, nice to see you. Yeah.
Are you still going to go to yourself first, then Carrie, and then Jim? Okay, here, Carrie, Jim. Okay, put you here. Put Carrie here, and then Jim, you're over here. We're just sort of line up in the order we got.
Very good.
Okay?
That was a good presentation. It's really helped. Dramatic. It's good to see you.
I don't resent you.
Good.
Thanks very much for doing
Don't be out there lollygagging, playing golf, and not come back.
We can see you if you
Yeah.
go out.
I was trying to remember. Well, that's an image we don't really need to have. So. You don't want to see me at the pool either, I promise. But happy, and I was thinking about how much the wind used to affect the flappy windows that were there before, and sometimes it got really hot.
There was one year when it was raining.
Oh yeah, the flood year.
It will indeed.
And Carrie and I decided on the sidewalk but immediately. Somebody's got a click. Who's the click?
I think we're still the flicker.
We're just looking for the clicker. You know how these speakers, when they walk off with it, take it home, play with it.
Well, Ruth was allowed. Ruth didn't have it.
She did have it with her.
Ruben got his computer over here. So we gotta find it. Let's see what happens.
That's what we're hoping for.
Really?
Probably part of our extra compensation. The black market.
Here we go. Oh, okay.
Well, actually, Ken does, and he's going first. I wasn't planning to, but I felt like I would like to be a good team member if I didn't make something out of it. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hey there.
Yes, ma'am.
And I'll let it.
For you, we'll do whatever. We will hang from the rafters and yell if that's what you want us to do. For you.
Okay, we're going to try to call this gathering back to order. So if everybody will resume your seats, we will return to your seats. We will resume our program. At the break, Nicole Magic Soto reminded me of the fact that I had forgotten we moved into the 21st century last year. Last year we began the process of having you, or letting you, if you choose to do so, submit your questions for this afternoon electronically. And there on the table, there's this little placard, a table card that will tell you how to go about doing that. So we'll take them either way, handwritten or submitted electronically. You will notice that we've got some new faces up on the dais today. We've demoted Bruce and Virginia. Not really, not really. They were just kind enough to move out to make space for our three audience panelists this morning. As I mentioned, we sent out a call for folks that would be willing to talk with you, talk with us collectively about their foundation's experiences in this area of activity that Ruth has just described. So this morning we have three folks with us. Ken Robinson, who is the CEO of the Dr. Phillips Charities in Orlando. We've got Carrie Dobberton, who's the CFO of the Python Foundation, part of Gary Community Investments in Denver. And then we have Jim Adams, who's the Vice President and Chief Investment Officer for the Boone Family Foundation in Dallas. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Well, thank you, Jim. And at great risk, he's invited the amateurs to participate. Dr. Phillips hadn't been involved in program-related investments up until 3 years ago, and our first investment was into Lift Orlando. In fact, we really hadn't even heard of them until we started attending the conference here and spending time, a little deeper time with this. The genesis for us was Lift Orlando, and where it came from was in Central Florida. We host the Citrus Bowl, and we have two different bowls that take place. We invite about 100,000 people into our community, and we were upgrading the bowl. We were spending $200 million, the city and the county, to do that. But in the shadow of the bowl sits an impoverished community, and the leaders inside the bowl thought, can't we lift the rest of the community as we improve the bowl? And that was the genesis of Lift. And Dr. Phillips got involved because certainly they weren't capitalized at that moment, and capital was a certain and urgent need. And the second issue that they had was they were brand new, so there wasn't anybody really willing to capitalize with them. In identifying what they would do, they started visiting places like East Lake up in Atlanta and learn about some impact investing. We worked with them at identifying a piece of property, and that piece of property is called Center Lake, Orange Center Apartments. And as you can see, Orange Center Apartments isn't anywhere that you would choose to live. It was the worst of Central Florida. Growing up there, it was in poor condition when I was growing up and continued to get worse and worse with absentee owners. And so how do you capture that property? It had gone from absentee owner to absentee owner, refunded by Fannie Mae every single time with the promise that they would improve but never would. So the idea was, let's go get that and pull it off of the market. Fannie Mae was foreclosing on it, but they certainly weren't willing to sell to us. They wanted to put it back onto the market. We worked with the government to get them to reconsider. They sold to the city of Orlando, and Dr. Phillips, through a program in related investment and mortgage, provided the funding to capture that property. The reason we didn't do it in a grant was because that money would immediately be out for a high-risk investment. There was a chance that this would never go through, that they wouldn't be able to get their low-income, their low-income housing tax credits, and that $4 million investment would just disappear. Our board was very, very skeptical, but we've been in real estate investment for a long, long time. And so in sitting with the board and trying to convince them this was the right direction to go, we started talking about the entitlements that were in place on this property, that we had the benefit of impact fees on the property. We really felt the value was there if worst case scenario that Lift Orlando failed and the property reverted back to Dr. Phillips Charities. We weren't looking forward to the day that would appear in the paper, but we were willing to take that risk. And so we became deeply involved in it, and this is what you see today. This just finished up about 4 months ago and opened 200 mixed income units. And it's really interesting. You have, in this property, you have people who are paying full market rate, you have people who are subsidized, and you have about 20 units that are completely free to the individuals. It is a total revitalization of the property. And the second phase is getting ready to start, which will be senior housing on the project. The senior housing will encompass 120 units. The first investment was $40 million. Our investment was $4 million. They've repaid that portion of the mortgage. The next second phase, they'll repay the second phase of the mortgage, and we'll be fully released from that and reinvesting back into the community. The next thing that starts to happen with this is other people come in and see this vision of a holistic approach to changing a community around. So it wasn't just putting an apartment in. It was about healthcare, it was about jobs, it was about pre-K, it was about a lot of different programs that could come into this with us. And you'll see in here, that's the second one, excuse me, some of the different people that are coming in to invest with us in this project. And so now you have, from left to right, you can see the 3 different phases of house construction, home living. And then you see Westlake Early Learning Center, where the Bainham Foundation has come in from Maryland to make their first investment here in Central Florida, provide $8 million of funding. That'll be groundbreaking in the very near future. Clarence Otis, who is CEO of Darden Restaurants, Red Lobsters, African-American gentleman, wanted to invest in this and is providing $9 million of funding. I believe he's providing $4 to $6 million of that funding to create a Boys and Girls Club inside this development. Westlake Health is coming in, and Westlake Health is a combination of Orlando Health and Florida Hospital, the 2 competing health organizations, moving into this sector, building it out, and working with Blue Cross Blue Shield to provide free health care inside the community. And then Lake Lorna Dune Park, between the city and Florida Citrus Sports, has funded $8 million to build a new park for them. It's an interesting process to watch your initial $4 million investment in such a short time, through great leadership in Lift Orlando, turn into almost $100 million worth of investment that's going to change lives for many, many, many futures to come. And if it was relied upon us just to make a grant, we wouldn't have done it. Having the program-related investment available to us where we could do it through a mortgage and secure our risk was the difference maker for us. Thank you.
To the right. How do I get mine up? Well, good morning. I'm Jim Adams from the Boone Family Foundation in Dallas. I thought I'd take a couple of minutes and share with you a little bit about who we are and why we do impact investing. For those of you who haven't been exposed to it, I thought maybe that story would be worthwhile. The Boone Family Foundation was created 11 years ago by the family of Cecilia and Garrett Boone, who created the Container Store, if you're familiar with the Container Store. And I made some slides. I don't really like slides, so I'm not going to read them to you. I assume you can read for yourselves. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about why we do what we do, because for a lot of folks that's an important decision to make at a foundation board and staff level. The Container Store was founded in 1978 by the Boones and some other folks after they created the idea, and it was a truly sustainable, ESG governed, however you want to describe it, business in 1978. They focused on their customers, they focused on their vendors, they focused on the world around them, they focused on their employees, and oh, by the way, last and least, they focused on their shareholders. And guess what? It worked out really well for the shareholders because they were focused on everything else that the business touched and everybody else that it did business with. And so at the very beginning, the Boone Family Foundation decided we wanted to learn about, understand, and start doing impact investing. And so the three reasons we did it are probably fairly obvious, but I thought I'd put them up there anyway. We wanted to be consistent. We wanted to use our endowment the same way we use our grants. And Ruth had a good slide, the gist of which is the same as my second point. You can leverage your grant making by using your endowment to create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be available with your grant making. And I think we've probably created as much impact through use of our capital as we have through our grant monies. And someday I'll stop and measure that, but I never have figured out how. And then we believe very much in collaboration. We've been involved in the creation of a group in Dallas called the Dallas Impact Investing Network. We think it's really important to leverage that collaboration and get other foundations and other philanthropists to use their capital and their endowments as well. So we think it's very important. It's something we started off doing, as I say, 11 years ago, back when there was nobody really talking about it, Ruth, and I wasn't even smart enough to set up a Google search. So, but we thank you for what your leadership has been. We do not do program-related investments, and the reason is simply that we will sunset, and we have always made grants in excess of the requirement, and so we never needed to count one as a PRI. That doesn't mean some of what we did wouldn't qualify, but we just don't do PRIs. So we've done, to use Ruth's terminology, mission-related investments and sustainable investments. And we do the whole gamut. We do our public traded securities in the foundation that way. Back in 2012, we found a little boutique investment firm called Nelson Capital, which has been subsumed into Wells Fargo. And they designed a very custom program for us based on the missional focuses of our foundation and using the positive screen approach. Do these companies do these things in this area? If so, we'll invest them in it, and if not, we won't. And the nice thing today, fast forwarding 6 years from when we started, is there's a lot of vehicles out there to do public securities investing that is sustainable, that is ESG based, and that is even based on the particular focuses of your foundation. And you don't have to give up returns to do it. You really don't. We studied it, we believed it was true, the academics say it's true, and we've lived it. We have not given up returns to do it that way. We've also done a lot of private investments, and I got a few examples on here. One of the foundation focuses for us is education. We spent a long time studying, is it possible to invest in education technology businesses? We decided the answer is yes, but you can't do it yourself. So we ended up finding a couple of small, very specialized investment funds, venture capital funds that have done it for us, one called OWL in Silicon Valley and another called Rethink. There are only 6 or 8 funds anywhere who even do this, and it's very, very specialized. And the fun thing for me about this as the guy who wears the investment hat rather than the grant maker hat is that the impact some of these little businesses that are brand new or a year or 2 or 3 years old is having is huge. For example, there's a company called Newsella, which provides language arts curriculum through the vehicle of daily news delivery, and it's custom tailored to K through 12, so it's different for every grade. And in 18 months from their founding, they were in 40% of the classrooms in the country. It's pretty hard to do that with a grant. Pretty hard to do that if you don't have a real profit motive and a scalable technology platform to do it. We've also done, and I know the examples and the regulations and others are credit, but we've opportunistically looked for things we could do that were private credit opportunities. My favorite one was when the American Reinvestment, I always get this wrong, the lawyers in the room will have to help me. The American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the 2009 stimulus bill, provided grants for charities. And it was really great. Start a new program, go do it, and send us a bill when you're all done. Well, charities don't have a lot of working capital for that sort of thing. So we created, with some other foundations in the Dallas area, a loan fund, and we loaned them the money on the front end so they could do what they were going to do before they got the grant from the federal government on the back end. And that was kind of a fun opportunity that may not come again, but the point is, if you look for and if you talk to other folks who do these kinds of investments, creative things will come up. And then lastly, I'll just mention, you can even sometimes find a way to sort of lend your portfolio to somebody. There's a charter school in Dallas that had been in another state and was moving into Texas, and they needed a lot of credit to get the lease deal done with their landlord, and so we obtained for them a letter of credit for their lease obligations. Doesn't cost us anything. We just park some money and it supports the letter of credit. So be creative. There's lots of ways to do impact investing, and we're happy, I know all of us, to talk with any of you later if you want to bounce ideas around. But thank you all for your attention.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So thanks, Ken and Jim, and now I have to follow them, so hopefully I can help provide some information that they haven't given all of you. I'm with Gary Community Investments, and again, that's kind of the umbrella of our two organizations, which are the Piton Foundation and Gary Community Investment Company. We use both philanthropic and for-profit or market rate investments to help low-income children in Colorado and their families, so we're place-based. But we also believe in order to help children, you specifically have to also help the family and the community. So we have a focus on family economic security and community economic development. When Bruce showed the continuum of all the capital that you can use, we definitely will use all of it. We look at trying to fit the problem to the solution so that we're not stuck in one area or another. We're really trying to figure out what's best for the situation. So I'm going to give you a quick idea of a PRI that we've done, and then talk a little bit. I think an interesting area that Ruth had brought up is that gap between where you're making impact investments and the ones that really are more focused on your programs that you can make full market rate returns. So one of the PRs that we did, what's interesting about this one is we actually didn't get it going with it at the beginning. It started in 2010, and it was a TOD fund, Transit Orient Development Fund, around Denver region, and it was kind of a partnership between Enterprise Community Partners and CLT. And basically what they do is they're trying to get ahead of affordable housing. So basically, let's purchase land, and then let's also develop it for low income and affordable housing, so that around transit areas that you wouldn't have gentrification, which we know is a huge problem here. So we became involved in 2014, 2015 when MacArthur, who was one of the original, they changed their strategy and wanted to kind of, at that point, the fund was so incredibly successful that they wanted to extend the life of it, and they also wanted to increase the amount of money going into the fund. So we became involved, and this is a revolving fund, and it's 4 tiers. So it's a capital stack. So you had the city and county of Denver providing a first loss position. Then you had kind of that second tier, which was Enterprise, the owner of the fund, providing some funds as well. And then you had the foundation group, which was about 12%, adding a PRI at 2%. And then, of course, that attracted CDFIs, and that attracted banks to come in and provide 4 to 5.5% interest. So the other way that we actually really helped in this situation was that we have a program called SHIFT Research Lab. And we have a lot of data about neighborhoods in Colorado and around Denver about where might be a good place for affordable housing, where there's health and there's education. So we also contributed to this fund kind of that analysis so that they could find or locate, near a half mile to light rail, but a 1/4 of a mile or whatever to buses, find good locations to put these affordable housing units. The goal was to have 2,000 affordable housing units. Right now, we're at 1,262, And we've done 15 loans, and again, they're revolving, so we hope to get to that 2,000 number by 2020. So that's the PRI, an example of a PRI, but working with a lot of partners, local foundations, the city and county of Denver to make this happen. So the next area that I feel pretty passionate about is mission-related investments. Back in 2013, we decided to go full board that we wanted 100% impact investments in our corpus. We went through a pretty good due diligence process. We invited 15 people, and we were pretty rigorous about getting down to the one that we chose. And I would say, if anyone's interested or hasn't gotten into this field yet, who you pick is so important. There's a lot of people in this field that are good idea people, but getting the right person that has both the financial and the impact side is very important. So we started on that back then, and we're now at 98%. As Jim talked about, it's really pretty easy on the public equity and the fixed income side to actually find investments that even place-based, going through screens like shareholder advocacy. Those are actually pretty easy to flip into. The areas where really you can find the impact and partnerships going forward, I would say, is in the private equity realm, the real asset realm, and alternative investments. And this is an area where you're actually creating impact, and I also find that they're very philanthropic thinkers. They're trying to solve social, environmental problems, so they're actually very much in line with foundations. And that, since we converted, I will say too that our investment policy statement was very, we wanted the return. We would not give up on the return. That was our number one priority. All of our investments go through a very rigorous financial review first. And then we look at the impact side. We meet every single one of our fund managers or partners, and we follow up with them to see the impact that they're creating. So through that process, we were able to identify people that were really aligned with some of the program stuff that we were doing. So we have started actually doing what I would call that blank space, or that gap that Ruth talked about, which is really aligning with our program areas. So early child in particular, we have an objective, 3 things that we want to get out of our mission-related investments in that area. One, it's a very undercapitalized area. It's also a very risky area, and early childhood, it's hard to find solutions. So we're trying to find those unusual players that can come up with solutions. So that's kind of our objective of going after the early childhood sector. So one of our investees was, our investment funds is Learn Capital. We said, hey, can you go out there and do a market analysis and see if we can find something in the early childhood? So they did that, and they said, 5 years ago, not so much. Now they're like, you know what? We're starting to see a lot of action. We have 2,000 plus companies in the pipeline. We're starting to see more of these early childhood education companies coming about. So we talked with them, and then we decided to do kind of a fund embedded in one of their seed funds around early childhood. Again, 2 things. This structure, one, allows us to test the market. So we came out and we tried just a full-on early childhood fund, and it bombs. Do you think we're really attracting capital to the field? Are we really de-risking? So we kind of talked about first doing that, and then we backed off and did the embedded within an early an ed tech fund. So we took 20% of that ed tech fund will be going to early childhood and childhood development. That was the name of the fund's called Learn Star, in case anybody's interested in investing. We teamed up with other foundations that are also interested in it, and we also get access to some of the companies coming through. So a couple things with that. I would say we did full due diligence on this because we wanted them to be very strong, so we did full due diligence. We also talked to them about technical assistance. And I think that's a place that foundations can really play. Technical assistance, and you can give them in the form of grant or whatever to help with the impact side, help with doing research or that sort of thing. And so we're working with technical assistance to help these companies to help low-income children. So basically, it's just a really good format for us to do this. So I will tell you that we've already found one company that we've invested in that we are actually working with to get to Colorado to help low-income children. Their name is Wonder School. They actually, we made a $90,000 investment. They're mission aligned. There's something that they do that nobody else does or hasn't been able to solve is getting providers in early childhood quality and getting a lot of people in that area, because the average amount that a provider makes is $30,000, and that's not good enough to attract quality professionals. So basically what they do is they provide the back office, their business partners. Somebody can start something in their home, they can rent an apartment or do whatever, and they're provided with the licensing, the communication, the marketing, all that stuff. And then they also provided the platform so that parents can go to the platforms and sign up their kids or come for interviews or anything like that. So what's great about this is that before they really talked with us, and Ovidia is also involved, is they were full market rate. Let's go for the affluent parents. But now their goal is 40% subsidies to get the 40% low-income children part of their model. And part of our reason for being involved or investing in them specifically is that they want to come to Colorado. In a year, they've grown so incredibly fast. They have a lot of people interested in them. But we want them here in Colorado. We want them here to help low-income children. So we're going to bring them here and help them get into this market. So that's part of the reason for doing that. So.
Great. Thank you. Before we turn to Celia, I have just one question that I'm sure is shared by many of you. We've heard these fantastic examples of what these foundations have done. It is apparent that it takes a considerable effort on the part of staff or consultants or others. It's a lot harder to do this than to make grants. How do you convince your boards that this is a wise expenditure of resources in that effort?
Have to.
Good.
Yeah, so we are lucky enough, we're fully funded. The Garys wanted to go, full board into this area. They wanted to take on as much risk. They wanted to be disruptive. So for us, actually the pressure's on us. We need to be creative and we need to make this stuff work. So, for us, we didn't have to convince the board. We have to convince the board that we're making this work.
We were fortunate the same. We didn't have to convince them. We asked, would you like to do this? And they said, go.
Great. Jim?
Probably in a little different boat. We're more traditional and less disruptive. I think Jim knows that from experience. And so it's just weighing the risk from, removing the risk as best possible and helping them understand that.
Great. Okay, now we're going to move into Celia's part of the program with continuing interaction, we trust, with our panelists here. The panelists obviously are going to remain. Hopefully they'll be around this afternoon for questions that you may have. So we'll now, Celia, you'll take over the direction.
Thank you very much. I left one piece of paper I've got to go get. So we've talked about impact investing at this conference for probably maybe 5 years or so. And I remember the first year we talked about it, we asked the audience how many people have done impact investing. There are really very few hands that went up. What about this year? How many of you are working with organizations that do impact investing? Quite a few, but I would say not quite 50%. So I'm hoping that what we'll accomplish today is that those of you that are here will be able to go back to your boards and do what Jim said, which is, well, how do you convince the boards that this is something, something to really consider to be involved in? And I think the examples that you've gotten from Ken and Jim and Carrie give you some real examples of things that you can do. So why the focus of today's session is going to be, of my presentation, is going to be design of a complex PRI investment. And I'm going to try to focus on the practical sides and some of the more complicated business/legal issues that come into play. You'll see in my materials that I have a lot of information in the beginning about MRIs and then some general legal stuff about program-related investments, and I am very grateful to Ruth for having covered some of that material, and we'll now be able to focus, I think, more on the really practical side of it. But one thing I do want to make a pitch for is to expand on the question Jim asked of why would foundations want to do this? And I think the answer is that more and more foundations are really looking for ways to solve complex problems. And there's not enough grant money in the world to solve some of these complex problems. I think there's a recognition on the part of foundations, many of whom were set up by entrepreneurs, that entrepreneurial capital is really necessary. You've got to get the private sector interested in some of these issues, or you're never going to be able to solve the problem. And I think Ken's example was a great one, where you put in, $4 million in the beginning, and now we've got this $200 million investment. And so I think what's happening is there's more and more recognition on the part of foundations and foundation boards that grants are good, grants are great, but there's a limit to what you can do with the grant, and that if you use some of the investment tools, you can accomplish something more. And so we're going to talk about the PRI investment tool in just a minute. One thing I do want to say, though, is that although today's talk is focusing on complex PRIs, I don't want to make it seem like MRIs can't be complex. And so I'm going to relay an anecdote that Virginia gave me at the beginning before the presentation today. Sometimes there's a sense that really there's nobody out there that's ever going to look to see whether your MRI program really met the right requirements. You think, well, the IRS is really busy, they're not ever going to do it, state AGs, they just don't have enough resources. And Virginia was telling me about a very complex, jeopardizing investment IRS audit that she has. You all are welcome to ask her whatever more details you can, but that there are some issues there in a jeopardizing investment. So we just shouldn't assume that these things will never arise. So I'm now going to move ahead. Let's see. And we're going to talk about what makes a PRI complex. And if you're following in your materials, this is, I think, page 18 of my slides. So what's a complex PRI? I would say that complex PRIs can involve typically equity investments. Those are really, I think, the most complex kind of PRI. It used to be that most PRIs were in the form of debt, and debt's complex too. Ken has an example of how they had to make sure they had adequate security, for their debt, and there's a lot of complexity, but equity, I think, adds an additional layer of complexity to it. And one reason is that when you make a debt PRI, you're giving debt to a company or to an entity to do a specific thing with those dollars. You're saying, use these dollars to do this specific thing. And when you're focusing on equity, you're making an equity investment, then this is really going to be an intermediary investment. You're not going to serve your direct charitable purposes by making the equity investment. You're looking at the company that you're investing in as the intermediary to serve that ultimate charitable class that you have, whether that charitable class is the people that are going to be the beneficiary of the educational technology, the new learning tools that are going to be created, or the people that are going to live in the low-income housing or are going to be getting the benefit of the Boys and Girls Clubs or whatever. But these are all being done through intermediaries, and they're being done typically through a corporate intermediary. So one thing that makes a complex PRI is it's an equity investment in a for-profit company. And it's further complicated because oftentimes the PRI equity investments are made in very early stage companies. They're made in early stage companies that have great ideas, but they haven't proven, their ideas haven't proven to be successful yet. There's no track record. You know, the founder may not have a history of setting up 5 companies just like this before. And so they're risky. And the founder may well have never dealt with a PRI before. The founder knows how to raise money, but doesn't know how to raise money from foundations and doesn't know the constraints that foundations have to operate under. And so that's one of the challenges. That's one of the things that makes for a complex PRI. And one of the things that I find is a particular surprise to companies is when they understand that if they don't deliver on the charitable things that they're supposed to deliver on, they have to, you know, that you have to be able to exit the investment. You have to be able to get out of the investment. So that kind of comes as a surprise because they want their equity investors to be in there with them no matter what. And of course, if you're a foundation investor, you want to protect yourself if the company pivots. The company pivots away completely from the charitable things, the charitable reasons you invested, and does a whole new line of business. So that is things that makes it complex. Another complexity is what happens if you're a foundation and you're making a PRI investment and there are other for-profit investors that are investing at the same time. You may say, well, how can that be a PRI? How can I say that I have no significant purpose of earning income or appreciation at the same time that these for-profit investors are coming in? And indeed, the IRS regulations say that in determining whether something is a good PRI or not, a negative factor is the fact that for-profit investors will invest on the same terms. So that becomes an issue that you have to deal with and work with your counsel on it when you're doing that kind of investment. What we often find is that in these early stage investments, these are investments that a foundation would not be prepared to make out of their regular investment portfolio. And the reason is because they're very early stage, there's not a track record of success. For the investment to be really successful, there's going to be lots more capital infusion that's going to be needed at a later stage, and that the role of the foundation is to put in some of that money like Ken did, and there may be some other for-profit investors that are in similar kinds of early stage venture capital funds that are willing to do that as well. And I might stop here because I would love to get the input from our other speakers about, you know, whether you have found it to be a challenge when you are working on PRIs and you have other for-profit investors that are investing at the same time.
Anybody?
Go ahead, Ken.
We didn't have any other for-profit investors involved in the project, but to your point about the life cycle of a PRI, certainly an exit strategy is an important part of it, and ours involved that.
Okay.
Yeah, since we don't do PRIs, we haven't technically gotten into that issue, but there are issues that are common whether it's formally a PRI or not. I think one thing that a lot of people who aren't used to doing this kind of investing may not think about is if you're making what is essentially kind of a venture stage investment, you're going to be putting more money in later. And a lot of people don't realize that and don't plan for that, and that's a really easy thing to trip over as an economic and substantive matter.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't actually, most of the stuff we've been in hasn't been where there's a lot of for-profits, except for the example that I gave earlier. But for us, we have our IPS and our policies really dictate what goes into PRI versus an MRI.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So some PRIs, complex PRIs, are direct investments in a company. And some of them are investments in funds that are then going to invest in a company. So in a straight PRI equity investment in a company, you have a one-stage intermediary. And when you're investing, making a PRI investment in a fund, you've really got 2 stages of intermediaries before you finally get down to that ultimate charitable beneficiary that you're trying to serve. One of the things that I think is a bit of can be a bit of a challenge in making a PRI to a company is what if that company has multiple lines of business? Now, your easiest is an early stage company that only has one line of business. Carrie, I think you alluded to that before, where there's an alignment of interests, or someone alluded to that, where there's kind of a complete alignment of interests between what the company is going to do and what it is that the foundation is interested in. But what if the company has more than one line of business? And what if the foundation's interested in one line of business, but the other line of business doesn't meet those charitability requirements? What happens then? Well, one of the things that the foundation has to do in order to make a PRI is it has to establish that the PRI has a primary charitable purpose, and it has to make sure that there's not going to be too much private benefit to that company from providing this favorable kind of infusion of capital. So this is where, when a foundation is making a PRI investment, a very important consideration is to define what your charitability requirements are going to be very explicit about what it is that you're expecting the company do to meet these charitability requirements, and then to balance that out against, you know, whatever private benefit the company is going to get from the fact that you have made an investment on very favorable terms. And as Ruth said, the IRS regulations reflect the fact that you can have some private benefit from a PRI, but you've got to have overwhelming charitable purposes. You've got to have enough charitable benefit that balances out so that the private benefit is really insignificant. And where this comes about in PRIs that have multiple lines of business is that the foundation has to protect itself from an investment in a company, thinking the company is going to pursue a charitable line of business, and then the company finds that that line of business is simply not as economically successful. Maybe the other line of business is a lot more successful, and the company that has a profit motive wants to gravitate over to that. So this is where the negotiation process comes in. And the negotiation is usually done through a side letter, in my experience, where a private foundation will, in making an investment, have a side letter with a company that will build in all of the PRI requirements, and will require the company to meet some specific charitable benchmarks and deliverables over the term of the investment, and will provide that if those aren't met, that the company has to buy the foundation out. Now, that's kind of that can be a tough pill to swallow for a company to think, well, we might have to buy this investor out. Where are we going to get the money? Where are we going to come up with the money to buy this investor out? How are we going to be able to do that? And I think the answer that we give is, well, this is all within your control. You're never going to have to buy us out if you simply do those things that you've told us that you want to do, and that's why we're investing. So this is completely within your control. If you pivot, if you decide to do something else, that's not why we invested, and so we need to get our money back. One of the things that can be a challenge, too, is for the company to understand that the PRI requirements have to be met over the life of the investment. And so if you make an equity investment or a debt investment, either one, and the company spends all that money right away in the first couple of years, as long as the company is a PRI, has a PRI investment from the foundation, those charitability requirements have to continue to be met. And this can be a surprise, and it has to be, one of the things that we found is very important in a successful PRI, equity PRI, and this is probably true with an MRI too, is clarity upfront, clarity so that everybody understands, what the expectations are and are prepared, to meet those expectations. One of the things that a company that has never never had a PRI investor may be surprised about too is the reporting requirements, because there are some significant reporting requirements that apply to program-related investments under the tax laws, and those are touched on in my, in my outline. And I'm curious to ask our panelists whether they run into any issues up front in negotiating PRI investments in terms of being able to get the kind of reports that you want. And I want to make sure that I include Jim in this question, because with respect to MRIs, since foundations are making MRIs with a charitable objective as well, what do you do to make sure that you get the information back that you need on the mission benefits from your MRI investments?
You want me to go first? We have never done an equity investment in a single enterprise directly. We've only done it through funds. On the credit side, we've made a lot of loans to single enterprises, and we essentially get them to give us the same information we would if we were giving them a grant, and it's just kind of simple that way. The equity investments we've made through different funds, and in those cases we ask for and in fact get reports from them, some of which are amazingly robust. I was just pulling up one for one of these ed tech funds, and from last year it's 71 pages long. It's a very, very detailed report, and they're happy to do it because it helps them raise more money.
Yeah, for our PRIs, it's similar to our grants. We have an investment, an impact department, a strategic assessment they're called. So we, for all our grants and our PRIs, we ask for the same thing. On the MRI side, I think for the ones that are more aligned with our values, I think we take the reports that they give us, but I think the ones that we view more tied to directly our mission, we work with them. I think this is an area that is harder, and that you do have to have a little bit patience and have milestones with, is getting them into what the impact they're creating, and is this the right measurement, and working with them instead of this is what you need to do, so that you're being true to the process too. So I think from our perspective, we're realizing that there's some technical assistance or grant piece that might be a component of that area.
For us, we treated it much like a grant, and so we wrote up a grant agreement that was attached to the mortgage with it, and it allowed them to understand up front what the expectations were. They look at us as a long-term investor, so they'd like to see us reinvest the $4 million once they repay it. So they're very attentive to what we request.
I think
I'll
that's...
just make one comment that what I would encourage folks to think about is the need to have this expectation articulated early in the process, because lots of folks coming at this from a business perspective or even from a public charity perspective have no clue as to what you're asking them for from the private foundation perspective. And if you don't build that in at the very outset, you're going to get kicking and screaming. I spent 2 hours on the phone yesterday with counsel for the other side in a transaction, kicking and screaming about, well, you never told us that we were going to have to do this back when we started talking about this in March. So early disclosure of what your expectations are is very important.
I have to say, Jim, I agree completely with you. I think that if you're looking at a PRI, the PRI regulations say what? They say that you have to get annual narrative and financial reports back from the PRI recipient. And then you have to get another report at the end of the investment. And your financial report has to say sort of how they spent the money. And that's all they say. And for an MRI, there's all it has to do is not be a jeopardizing investment. There's no requirement at all for an MRI to show any kind of social return. So it is really critically important up front that if you're making an MRI, that you establish that you're not just like the other investors. You don't just want the bottom line financial information, but you need to negotiate up front with them and put it in writing somewhere what kind of reports they have to deliver to you, or they won't. And I have a story about a private foundation that made MRIs, and their board had authorized an MRI program, and so they were about 2 years into the MRI program, and they had some very early financial results, and they were okay. They were a little disappointing, but they were okay. And so the CFO was going to give a report to the Foundation's investment committee about the results of these MRI investments. And so the investment committee said, okay, well, we understand. We knew these were going to be MRIs, so we didn't expect, the top dollar investment. So now tell me about the mission results. And that hadn't been built in at the very beginning. And so the CFO had some general ideas about what was accomplished, but not the kind of really hard data that the foundation was looking for. So I just passed that along to you. And in the PRI area, what many foundations will do is to have something that they may call a key indicator document, or a key indicator attachment to the PRI document, or a specific metrics that the foundation wants to see the PRI recipient report on. And so this may, and you need to work that out up front, because the PRI recipient has to be prepared to collect that data. And the PRI recipient's going to have to get that data either from its, from its own activities, but it's got to know what it is the foundation's going to be looking for so that it can build all of that into the agreement.
Hey,
up
Celia?
front. Yes.
Celia, let me just, I'll just chime in also. Risk management is a buzzword, but I think this documentation also goes to risk management. As I mentioned, the IRS sort of has a view of you guys as a bunch of cowboys, that now that we've waved the green light, y'all are going to go out there and just like, woo, dollars, there it goes. And if you go in and and your MRI investments are just demonstrably lower than the rest of your portfolio, which one would not be surprised. The notice says that's okay to trade off. The natural question is, well, where's the trade-off? And if you don't have the data 6 years hence, when from the time you make the investment and you make it, and then you have the returns, and somebody actually comes and looks at this, it's going to be really hard to go back and gather it after the fact and to say, no, really, it was a much more impactful investment. It can be really hard to gather information later that would have been pretty easy to gather at the time.
One quick thing, for the Learn, Start, and some of the stuff that we do MRIs directly, we do it through a side letter, agreement. Yeah.
And I think the use of side letters is a great tool. I think that when foundations make PRIs, or it could be true of an MRI too, but it's certainly true of a PRI, one of the keys is to make sure, as I said before, that everybody understands, that there's common expectations. And one way to do that is to have a term sheet up front. And I'm a big advocate of having a term sheet that you give to the potential PRI recipient, particularly if it's an equity investment. And this term sheet will outline what the key elements are going to be, and including what the reporting requirements are going to be, including a requirement that funds have to be repaid if they're not used for charitable purposes, and so forth. Because you don't want to go way down the road with a potential with a company, and then it's their first ever PRI, and they don't really understand what all the implications are, and their lawyers are probably regular corporate lawyers, and their lawyers may not have any experience with PRIs. So I'm a big advocate that you can save yourself a lot of time and effort by giving them a term sheet up front once you know the basic business terms, and putting in what the PRI requirements are going to be, and putting in any special requirements that you may have about what you want to see in the reports and so forth. Get all that out of the way, up front, and then move on, to your deal documents. So we've been talking so far mostly about PRIs that are in a single company. I want to talk about what happens when you make a PRI through a fund. Because I think there are lots of situations where you may find, or some foundations find, it's more efficient not to make the PRI directly on a company by company by company basis, but to make it in a fund, and then require the fund to make the underlying investments that are going to meet the foundation's criteria. And this can be, this can be great. Somebody referred to the fact that in the educational technology area, that was you, Jim, I think, and this was in the context of an MRI, but same deal on a PRI. There may be groups out there, funds out there that really have expertise in this area, and you may want to work through them. So what happens if you are making an investment in a fund, and that fund is then going to invest itself, in companies? It's not a direct investment. What can be some of the tricky issues? What can make some of this complex? Well, one of the things that can make some of this very complex is that the fund you're investing in may not be a 100% charitable fund. The fund may have a goal of doing certain kinds of investments, and some of them may meet the charitability requirements, and some of them may not. So how do you do that? Well, foundations are certainly allowed to be investors in a fund if a proportionate part of the fund is going to be charitable, and foundations do this all the time. But what's key in those kinds of situations is that the foundations have charitability requirements, and they then require the fund in which they're investing to invest at least a certain percentage of its capital into these things that are going to be considered qualifying investments. And when we do them, we typically call them QCIs, qualified charitable investments. And so the fund document will have an attachment that will say, this is how we define a qualified charitable investment. If the foundation is investing 10% of the equity in the fund, it will typically require that 15% of the fund's investments be in these qualified charitable investments. And then it's important to make sure that the fund knows that it's going to be responsible. It's going to be making the actual investment decisions, but it's got to have a process that's going to let it vet these investments to make sure that they do become these qualified charitable investments. And it's going to have to monitor these investments and what they do, and it's going to have to get reports back from these companies that it invests in so it can flow all of those things up in the PRI, in its own PRI report. So what do you do when you have those kind of situations? Well, one thing that I have seen some foundations do is to have a sidecar fund. And by a sidecar fund, I mean a fund with the same general partner as the fund in which you would be investing, but the only other partner in that fund is the foundation. And so it would be a 100% charitable fund, and it would invest side by side with the main fund in these funds that meet the charitability requirements. So that's one potential solution. Now, one thing that's a trap for the unwary when you invest in a fund is if you invest in a fund, not through a sidecar, some of the fund investments might be made in pass-throughs rather than C corporations. A C corporation is just like a regular corporation, and the only form of income that you get from that is going to be dividends, and that's never going to generate unrelated business income as long as it's not debt financed. But what happens if the fund is going to invest in some limited liability companies? And some of those limited liability companies might do things that would be unrelated business income. So if you are investing in a fund, you would typically either require the fund only to invest in things that are going to be C corporations, or you would use this kind of a sidecar fund so that you would make sure, if it's not a 100% charitable fund, that the foundation wouldn't have any unrelated business income as a result of it. I don't know whether any of you have ever worked with sidecar funds before. Oh, okay. You have?
Yeah.
What's your experience with that? How's that worked out?
So usually if there's more foundations, then they can put a blocker in type situations. So
yes.
Yeah, so it's more through that. And sometimes we're okay with UBIT if we look at it and analysis shows that we're still above market rate and that it still works for us. So we do both.
And that's a really good point, because some foundations are what I call allergic to UBIT. They think that any unrelated business income is really bad, and the answer is no, it's really not. It's just that you have to take that into account and make sure that the return that you're going to get is still going to be the return you're expecting, even though some of it may be subject to the unrelated business income tax. Some foundations simply have investment policies, though, where they don't want to invest in anything that's going to generate unrelated business income. And in that case, these fund investments can raise some issues.
One comment, Celia, for you to expand upon, or others. We've been talking, of course, and we're focused on tax and fiduciary legal principles. But whenever you get into the world of fund investing, you've got to know and take account of the fact that there are securities laws that are applicable at both the federal and the state levels. And so sometimes you're going to encounter circumstances in which you could inadvertently run afoul of federal or state securities laws, and you want to be attentive to that in your exercise.
That is a great point. That's a great point, because in most cases when a foundation is investing in a fund, it's just going to be an investor and someone else is the sponsor of the fund, and the sponsor of the fund is going to have the primary responsibilities for ensuring that there's compliance with the securities laws. Either there's registration, or there's not registration, but there's exceptions from the registration requirements. But some cases foundations actually act as sponsors of investment funds, of PRI funds, and in those cases the foundations are just like any other, any other securities issuer, and they have to make sure that those requirements are met, and foundations may have to make representations to the funds that they're investing in that will help ensure that the funds will comply with the securities laws. So that, not losing track of that from the corporate side is very important. Okay, I think we've got just a few minutes left, and so let's talk about a case study of a complex PRI, and I think it's one that, it's not probably your most complex PRI, and it's actually based on some real examples, but let's see what you think about it and see what the others on the panel think about it. So this is an example, and we could use Detroit as the example here. Let's just use Detroit, because I think although I didn't base this on something that was in Detroit, it really could be. Because Detroit's a region that was heavily dependent on the automobile industry, and Detroit was known for being very, very innovative. There was lots of innovation in Detroit, but the innovation all focused around the auto industry. And so the auto industry has changed a lot, and so let's assume that there's an effort to try to do economic revitalization and jobs creation in the region and to focus it in a different area. And what you see a lot of times are sort of collaborations between involving state universities or involving 501c3 accelerators. There may be some of you may be familiar with 501c3 organizations that are accelerators. And their mission is, they're 501c3s because their mission is educational, and what they're really going to focus on is teaching in these kind of economically challenged areas, teaching budding entrepreneurs how to be a good entrepreneur. How do you start up? How do you start up a business? What does it take to be successful? And so you may have another 501c3, or you may have a university that offers these accelerator programs, and the goal is once you get through the accelerator program, you should be ready. You should have the knowledge, the business plan, and so forth, be ready to basically get capital, early stage capital. And in some areas, you may have the local businesses that want to be partners in all of this. And so there may be local businesses that are setting up an early stage capital fund that's going to invest in these little companies that have been through the accelerator program. So what happens if you have a private foundation that wants to invest, and it wants to invest alongside these other early stage investors in the community. They want to invest in this for-profit fund, and the mission of this for-profit fund is to really invest in these early stage companies that are going to bring jobs and bring hopefully prosperity to the region. So what does the panel think about that? Is that the kind of thing you would entertain as a PRI? Might it be something you could entertain as an MRI? What do you think?
I think for us, it could be either, based on because we're early stage. We have X amount that we'll do early stage, so it would be something that we'd entertain as either an MRI or PRI, depending on more details to follow.
If we did PRIs, we'd entertain that, but we would definitely entertain it for an MRI. We run a fairly similar fund in Dallas already, actually.
Okay.
We've been approached on this exact topic, and we've been a little skittish of it, but I think it would be more appropriate under an MRI, and we'd be very comfortable trying it.
Okay. So I think that if you look to see the question I asked, can this qualify as a PRI? And I said yes, if. The first thing I said is that the early stage companies are all C corporations, meaning we're not going to be investing in any LLCs. And one of the challenges here, because we talked about how this fund is going to have other for-profit investors, and it may be that really some of the companies that go through the accelerator program may have business plans that may not be as directly focused on bringing jobs to this particular community or creating, addressing the issues of this community. And so this is, I think, a good candidate for a situation for a foundation to make a PRI. And the foundation doesn't necessarily want to burden the whole fund with these kind of charitability requirements, focusing on, locating in depressed areas or creating jobs for people that are at the lower end of the economic spectrum or whatever. So you don't have to have that. It doesn't have to be a 100% PRI fund. It could be a fund that has a limited amount of PRI requirements, but then it could be just a regular fund. I think if it's an MRI, meaning that it's early stage, but there's enough there to meet your prudence requirements. I mean, there's still got to be enough there. And so if there is enough there, if you can make it as an MRI, then it's even better, because then you don't have to put any particular restrictions on saying that a portion of the portfolio has to do this or that or the other. If you're going to do this as a PRI, then you need to have that, you need to meet all the PRI requirements, so you need to have your side letters that say all of the right kind of, PRI requirements, and you need to make sure, that your PRI recipient sort of understands what the constraints are. What else? What are some of the other things that you all would think about if you were considering this kind of investment?
Well, the black hat lawyer always has to think about what happens in the event of a default.
Right.
You've got to build in the remedies for a default, and that's always an unpleasant negotiation.
And you could default by not meeting the charitability requirement, and that's one kind of default. That's where we would say, well, you're going to have, if it's a PRI, you're going to have to buy the foundation out. You could default because it's not a good investment. The investment loses money, and I'm curious about what kind of steps the panelists take to try to protect themselves against both what we might call a charitability default and then just a regular old, economic default or failure of the investment.
Ruth mentioned something earlier, which is a market rate return is not a bad thing. And that was always my concern under the MRIs, in thinking that with this risk, if you can get up something close to 7%, 6%, then it's going to make it a little more appealing to take some of this risk on, understanding that it might all just disappear.
Yeah, and I'll just add another couple of words about the idea of the market rate return. In a lot of the conversations I was having, people were talking about a market rate return. I had someone ask me actually at one of the conferences. We've been afraid to make a PRI that would give a return that was greater than the federal rate, 3%. And I like, as if market rate was, 3% and above, and below market rate was under 3%. And I thought, where did this come from? People were actually thinking that the market rate is a rate, 5, 7, 9, but the rates in the market really are dependent on the risk. And so while a 5% return may be a great like above market rate for a bank account that you can get right now, a 5% return would be a woefully below market rate for the type of risks that a lot of times are being taken in these kinds of investments. And so in those sorts of situations, you might see returns at 10 or 15%, which look really high compared to the ultra conservative investments in an ordinary portfolio. But compared to what a regular investor would require from an investment of that kind of risk, you're talking about VCs that want, 300x. And you have to remember that risk adjustment plays a piece in that, and document it that way.
And I think the documentation point is really, really important, because whether it's a PRI or an MRI, it's very clear under the law that you judge whether it's a good PRI or you judge whether it's a good MRI, and by MRI I really mean, a prudent investment, based on all the facts that exist at the time the investment is made. The regulations are clear that you do not use hindsight to determine whether it was a good PRI or a good MRI. And so what that means, and I know that we had there's another tax conference that's on 501c3s in general, and one year at that conference someone from one of the state AG's offices spoke, and they said that for purposes of MIFA, what they would really want to see is the documentation about what the foundation's expectations were at the time the investment was made, whether it's a PRI or whether it's an MRI. And so I think a good point to end this discussion with is just to stress the importance for a foundation to make sure that whether you're making an MRI or you're making a PRI, you're creating the right kind of documentation that could be looked at 6 years down the road to justify the decision you made and why the transaction qualified either as an MRI/prudent investment or a program-related investment.
So you can add one little thing to that. Whether you treat your example as a PRI or as an MRI, at the end of the day, you're making an investment decision, and you better have thought through it as an investment decision in terms of who it is that's managing this fund that's going to and being investing in early stage companies. Some of these companies will fail. It's guaranteed. How good are the people making the decisions about which companies to invest in is something you ought to do regardless of how you structure this thing.
And what do you do? And I'll just ask one last question, Jim. I think we maybe, how much, are we over time or 5 minutes? Okay. So what do you do about monitoring? When you make program-related investments or when you make mission-related investments, we've talked about documentation on day one, but what do you do in terms of monitoring the investments to try to play a role to help keep them on track or to do some early intervention if it looks like things might be going off track?
I'll go first. Private investing takes a lot of time to monitor. A lot of time, and there's never enough time. And all you can do in a situation like a fund is have conversations with the fund managers, read the reports, make sure the reports are coming out on the periodic schedule you want, and ask them a lot of questions when you see something that doesn't look good. As a partner in a fund, as a limited partner usually in a fund, you don't have a whole lot of rights, but you sure can burn up the telephone lines, and that's what we do.
So I think from a fund perspective, if we're talking about funds, it's where is your lane, right? So you have VCs or other people involved that will be watching that side. So for us, it's more the impact side. So in the Learn Start example, what we have on the side letters, we meet with them quarterly to go through pipeline, but we also every year require a report, not only financial but impact, where we can have those discussions about what's going wrong with certain companies or not, and where we have the opportunity to come in and give technical assistance or where we can track. So it's kind of how we set it up in our side letter.
For us, it was a single asset that we were investing into. And so we set up the normal semi-annual and annual updates, as well as milestones of certain timelines in the project that were being met.
And I think one of the messages I would deliver too is that if it's PRIs, you are going to be getting some written reports. You need to make sure somebody reads those reports. It has been known to happen that private foundations check, yes, we did get the report, but they actually don't have the program people or the lawyers or someone read the reports and read them in light of really what the proposal said and what the project was supposed to accomplish. So there's really no substitute for making sure that you get the information, and then once you get the information that you use it as best you can and that you're mindful about what it says. Okay, I think that's it.
Great. Well, we certainly do hope you have found this full morning program on this investing concept to be useful. We, of course, Ruth and Celia, long-time masters in this, but we're delighted to have Ken and Jim and Carrie to bring their concrete examples to describe to you what they actually have done, the approaches they've taken, and I'm confident that they will welcome any of your questions and your interaction and discussion throughout the rest of the seminar. So now we're going to take about a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back for one of the most exciting programs you could ever imagine. Okay? Thanks.
Most of these people don't have a staff. We don't. We have a staff of 2 plus me, who's been, I've spent about 15% of my time at the foundation. The other 100% is the family office.
expecting that. I'm good. I'm just going to run to the restroom real quick.
Yes, sir. Okay.
To make an announcement.
Yes, sir.
I was calling Southern young lady.
Yes. I'm not going to lie.
It gets better, actually.
A couple of months ago, I went to a dinner hosted by our investment advisor, Bernstein,
Yep.
who wanted to point out a lady at the dinner with whom he had the longest business relationship with since he was a Bernstein, and introduced her as, "This is Arlene, my oldest client." And everyone went, "Oh, no, you didn't."
At least I didn't know that. At least
That's a $10 million portfolio you're trying to replace. Hello, Vanguard.
That was funny. I was like, yeah, Jim will appreciate that.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have to do sign-in sheets for CPE for our accreditation. So if you let them know, Nicole's going to pass them out and just everybody sign in, pass them to the right, and pick them up at the end.
Oh, we should have done that before the break.
Well, no, it's actually good. We do it before lunch. That's the key. We have to do it every day. So, okay, I forgot about that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Got
ma'am.
my group out there just buzzing.
Oh, good. Well, it's, I mean, for folks that haven't done it before, it seems intimidating, difficult, and all that sort of stuff. But once you work through it well the first time, then it opens up all sorts of possibilities. So, use a network, absolutely. Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, I guess we got to get back to it, guys. Let me make an announcement that we forgot to make earlier. Some of you will be interested in getting credit for various professional purposes, law, accounting, or other purposes. We're required to have sign-in sheets this year. I don't recall that we've had to do that before, but what we're going to do is each session is pass around a sign-in sheet right before lunch, and so if you'll just pass that down the row, those of you that need credit for professional purposes, sign in, and we'll keep up with that. So now I promised you that one of the most exciting things that you could ever imagine for this seminar is up next, and that's going to be filling out a tax return, okay? So this is really, this is the high point of the year for all of us, and for all of the accountants. I mean, I just can't imagine the excitement that you have been building up for this. But seriously, what we're going to try to do is simply walk through among our faculty members some of the issues that we normally encounter, the questions that we normally arise from various organizations, and Bruce is going to lead us off talking about the 990 PF.
I think that's the name of the.
Yeah, you think so?
Now, are you going to do the?
I've got the clicker.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, here we go.
This is it. This is it.
This is it. Okay. Actually, the first two questions are not on the slide. The first question is filing this form optional? And as you may imagine, the answer is no. And secondly, are there any exceptions to the filing requirement? And once again, the answer is no. So as to the items that are on the slide, the Form 990-PF, of course, is the annual information return filed by private foundations. And the general rule for tax-exempt organizations across the board is that the return is due by the 15th day of the 5th month of the organization's tax year. So obviously, if it's a calendar year, May 15 is of the subsequent year is the due date. Like your for-profit counterparts and like yourself personally, there is an obligation, and has been for some time now, to file the tax due, the estimated tax due, on a quarterly basis. There's a form for that, 990W, and so you do want to calculate and estimate your year's tax obligations and try to file those, of course, on a timely basis quarterly. Like other tax returns and information returns, there is an opportunity to get an extension, so you can get an extension to file. The current period is 6 months, but the extension, as you can sort of see built into there on the slide, is an extension to file. It is not an extension to pay. So the idea would be, of course, if you need to extend for whatever reasons, usually preparation reasons, you still calculate the tax, ideally pay it on a timely basis, and then you've got the extra 6 months to prepare and file the return. The last item on the slide is a little more complicated. These first ones are pretty straightforward, obviously. Amended returns. Again, you can do this personally. For-profits do it. All other categories of tax-exempt organizations can do it. There's no real law on this. There's no law that says you have to file an amended return under any particular set of circumstances. But if there is a material omission, or there may be other reasons why you want to inject some information in the return. This is, after all, a public document, and there may be something that you wish you'd put in the return that you hadn't originally. you can file. So it's a judgmental question as to whether you file an amended return. It's something I think you ought to use with advice of counsel. And from an idealistic point of view, it's great to file a return, an amended return, if you need to, as I said, add information that you wished you'd put in before, or if you feel you have to because something has been omitted. The problem with filing an amended return, though, is that it increases the likelihood that the IRS is going to respond in some formal way, some inquiry, maybe even a formal examination. You know, the IRS is understaffed these days and underfunded, and so the likelihood of that happening today is less than might have been the case a few years ago, but it's something to take into account. So if you are considering filing an amended return, you do, in my judgment, have to take into account the possibility that you may have increased your likelihood of attracting the attention of the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay, the next part of the Form 990 PF we're going to look at is the allocation of expenses, and this comes into the form where, in what the form calls the analysis of revenues and expenses. And those of you that are return preparers or return reviewers will be quite familiar with this. Those of you who are trustees or folks who only look at this on an annual basis when it's prepared may not appreciate some of the nuances, I guess, with respect to the preparation of this part of the form. There are 4 columns on this part of the form. Most foundations will only use 3 of the columns. Column A, which is showing what the revenues and expenses are according to your accounting records. And then column B is taking those revenues and those expenses that are associated with the generation of net investment income. And so it is taking out of all of your expenditures which are the ones that relate directly to the investment function for your foundation. And then column D, as in Delta, is the far right-hand column, which is where the expenditures related to your charitable program are to be identified. For those foundations that utilize the cash basis of accounting, it's going to be fairly easy in most cases to see the relationship of the numbers that are in columns A, B, and D, because on a cash basis of accounting, the aggregate of columns B and D on any particular line will equal what is in column A. So in other words, column A is broken down for a cash basis taxpayer between the expenses that are reported in column B, your investment related expenses, and those that are reported in column D for your charitable program activities. The challenge is one of the challenges, is for those of you whose foundation utilize accrual accounting, because for mysterious and ancient reasons, the Internal Revenue Service has decided that column D is to be prepared on the cash basis of accounting, even if your foundation uses accrual accounting for everything else. And that's essentially because column D is the source of the information that goes into the determination of what the qualifying distributions of the foundation are. And qualifying distributions are computed on the basis of cash disbursements rather than on accrual accounting. So as you work, the other challenge, in addition to the distinction between accrual and cash accounting. The other important decisional process that goes into the preparation of this part of the form is determining how to allocate various expenses. The common ones, of course, are your legal expenses. If you get a bill for $10,000 from a lawyer, is that allocable in part to your investment activities so that it goes in column B, or is it allocable in part to column D as related to your charitable program activities? And so those are decisions that have to be made. For most foundations, probably the greatest challenge, the greatest record-keeping burden will be with respect to your payroll costs. Identifying which portion of your payroll costs for your staff personnel and perhaps for your directors or trustees belong in column B as related to your investment function, or belong in column D as related to the charitable program. The session that we've just concluded adds another dimension to all of this, and that is, all right, if we've got our investment personnel and we've got our staff personnel expending time on program-related investing activities, do we allocate that to column B? Do we allocate it to column D? Do we divide it in some fashion on some rational basis? The instructions don't tell you the answer to that. The instructions basically say you got to use a reasonable basis and you've got to be consistent from year to year to year. You can't pick and choose allocation methodologies in one year different from what you've used in prior years just because it gives you a result that you think is more favorable. Do any of you, Celia or Ruth, or any of you that have focused on PRIs or MRIs for that matter, given attention, detailed attention to this cost allocation issue?
Well, I think a lot of foundations would want to take their PRI expenses and put it in column D, because that, for purposes of meeting the qualifying distribution requirement, that's an administrative expense associated with a program activity, and they treat it the same way that they would treat, for example, a grant, the grant administration. So I think that's what a lot of foundations do. But MRIs, I think, would be squarely in column B.
Yeah, and Jim, I know that, like, for a lot of foundation clients, a lot of what I do will be in both column B and column D, but I don't think I've ever had a foundation client ask me to keep track of it for them. And I wonder, a lot of times, then when you see the 990 PF, a lot of times it's just kind of we just split it between the two. There's not a lot of, to your point, there needs to be a reasonable basis, and, somebody looking at the bills, somebody looking at the staff time, to those that are clearly on the investment side of the house, that one's easy. 100% of, for example, their salary can go in one, but, the executive director or, others with the organization, they really do need to be mindful of this and be thinking throughout the year and month to month, week to week, what did it look like, and it would change from year to year. And then where do you even put the discussion with the lawyer about whether something should be a PRI or an MRI? Do you split that hour down the middle between the two?
Reasonable is the answer.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, our next slide is what I've called G&A, General and Administrative Allocations, or the accountants among us may say that the more technically accurate term is management and administrative, or management in general, but I'm calling it G&A. In my experience, most of the accountants with whom I work file many more Forms 990 than Forms 990 PF, prepare and file. And the Form 990 has a chart, a layout in the Form 990 that looks very much like this, but contains a differentiation between the direct charitable program expenditures and the G&A expenditures, management and general expenditures. And so the accountants typically come to this part of the Form 990 with the expectation that they're going to have to segregate G&A expenses from the other expenses that are reported on the Form 990 PF. And so you'll see, I mean, obviously the part of the form I'm showing you is exactly what we saw on the slide before, and it's the same analysis of revenue and expense. And from time to time, I will encounter, I don't know whether others do, it'd be interesting to know, I will encounter accountants who say, well, wait a minute, G&A expenses do not belong in either column B or column D. They belong only in column A, and you can't take those management and general expenses and put them into either column B or column D. And that's just wrong. And so you have to go through the process of explaining that, in fact, the Internal Revenue Code, one of those things that not many people like to read, and the Treasury regulations, which even fewer people like to read, specifically call for the inclusion of the general and administrative expenses that are associated with these functions of private foundations. So it is indeed appropriate and to your benefit to ensure that your management and general expenses are properly included in either column B or column D as appropriate, depending upon what it is. Now, the next slide we've called reconciliation. Well, this is a word that strikes fear into the heart of a lawyer. I mean, here's where we need the accountants up here, right? But we don't have any accountants up here, so we're going to muddle along and then let you accountants correct us during the afternoon discussion session. But what we have to encounter, well, let me see a show of hands. How many of your foundations you'll use accrual accounting? Let me see it. Okay, so at least half of you here have used accrual accounting. So accrual accounting is one source for reconciliation challenges because, as I said a moment ago, your cash basis expenditures, charitable program expenditures, go in column D. And so the return preparers start looking around for a schedule that says, okay, where on the Form 990 do I reconcile my column D cash basis expenditures with my accrual numbers that are in column A? There is no specific schedule on the 990 PF that accommodates that reconciliation. Most accountants with whom I've worked will prepare a separate sheet, a separate work paper that demonstrates how they moved from their accrual basis numbers to the cash basis numbers that go in column D. And those are important pieces of accounting information to keep, but they are not required as part of the Form 990 PF. What the 990 PF does require here in Part 3 of the form is a reconciliation of changes in net assets from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And in my experience, lots of folks say, well, how do the column D numbers, the cash basis numbers, affect this part of the Form 990? And the answer is they do not. This part of the Form 990 PF is just looking at the balance sheet numbers and the books and records, financial basis numbers that show up in column A of the part of the form that we were looking at a moment ago. It looks at those revenue and expenses per books. And so that's what you're looking for in this part 1. It's what were the total assets at the beginning of the year? What happened with those assets during the course of the year? And then what are those assets at the end of the year? In my experience, the most common adjustment that will show up here in part 3 is attributable to the relatively new financial accounting standard that says you gotta write your investments up to market value. You no longer carry your investments on your balance sheet at their cost basis. You've got to adjust those. So when you adjust your year-end financials to hopefully an increased number, a fair market value number that is larger than your cost basis, you're going to have an amount of unrealized gain. And that unrealized gain is going to have to show up somewhere, and the place it shows up is on part 3, in this reconciliation of opening balance, closing balance for the value of your assets. Okay, who's got this one? Let's see. I believe this is Celia.
Celia,
This is yours.
I do
Right.
have this one. So when you are reporting your charitable activities, you have to report them in 3 different categories. You have to report your grants, and then you have to report something called direct charitable activities, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and then you have to report your PRIs. So one thing to focus on is, so what are these direct charitable activities, and why do some foundations actually like to go to all of the trouble of identifying what their direct charitable activities are and putting them in this particular category? So direct charitable activities are things that the foundation does. We're assuming we're not talking about an operating foundation here. We're just talking about a regular foundation. But they're things the foundation does directly to run its charitable programs. And a reason that foundations like to identify what these are and describe them and break them out is because if you didn't do that, they would just look like administrative expenses. And so some foundations want to make it clear that all of their activities, all of their expenses that don't relate to investments are really grant management expenses or sort of internal expenses. If some of their activities are actually running programs or charitable activities, they want to get some credit for that. And so they go to the trouble of identifying what that is and really writing good descriptions for the 990 PF. So what are direct charitable activities? The most common ones that I see are foundations. Some foundations run conferences, they run convenings, they gather people together for exchange of information. These are things that can be viewed as direct charitable activities. Foundations may engage consultants to advise the foundations about, certain kinds of activities that the foundations are interested in engaging in. Those may be direct charitable activities. And so what you see here is foundations and the instructions to the 990 PF give, I think, about 13 categories of things that are count as direct charitable activities. And so you want to take a look at that. Direct charitable activities can be not just the expenses of, the salaries of the people that run the direct charitable activities, but if you do convenings or conferences or things like that, there may be some space costs and some other kinds of costs associated with it. So this is something foundations do because they simply want to identify to anybody that's looking at it that some of what might appear to be just a regular old administrative expense are really for, foundation-run projects that instead of looking for their grantees to do them, they're doing them directly. One thing that I want to note here is that in many cases, in general, if you file your 990 PF and you do your best, you're reasonable, and you make the kind of allocations that Jim and Virginia talked about, there's no penalties. There's no penalties. The IRS might come in later on and say, well, I guess there could be some penalties with respect to if you counted things as direct charitable. You counted things as charitable expenditures and they really weren't. Maybe you wouldn't meet your distribution requirements. But otherwise, if you use good faith, there's not really penalties. But there's one, I think, important exception to that, and that is if you make expenditure responsibility grants. And many PRIs are going to be expenditure responsibility, are going to require the foundation to exercise expenditure responsibility. So in addition to reporting the PRIs on the form, you need to make sure that you include an attachment to your Form 990 with respect to every expenditure responsibility grant and every PRI that requires the exercise of expenditure responsibility. And there's about 7 things that you have to say. And most foundations just have a little chart, and they put a page for each one of those, in their 990 PF, or they put them all on a big chart. So that's one comment I want to make sure everybody is aware of. There's an example, there's a case actually of a private foundation that was found to have violated the expenditure responsibility rules and made a taxable expenditure simply because the foundation failed to file the ER reporting with its 990 PF.
Hey, Bruce, want to take this next one?
I will do it. This is part 10. You'll note in the title of it, it's got the word compute in there twice. So what you're ultimately doing here is computing the foundation's minimum investment return, because 5% of that is the number that dictates the qualifying distribution, the grant amount, and expenditures of that sort. The other computation is that of the asset value of the assets that go into the base in computing the payout. So as you can see from the return, the distinction has to be made at the outset between non-charitable use assets and assets that are used in carrying out charitable purposes. Actually, I'm going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow morning, so let's assume for this purpose that the foundation knows what its non-charitable use assets are. So the second computation is the fair market value of that. Lawyers like the distinction, make the distinction between matters of fact and matters of law. Valuation is a matter of fact, but having said that, the law does dictate a number of things, including the evaluation methodology, and it's the same one that Jim was talking about allocations. It has to be reasonable and it has to be consistent. But the law also talks about the timing of valuations, and in some cases dictating when there has to be an independent appraisal, and in some cases dictating who a qualified appraisal is. So computing this value is important, obviously, because if a mistake is made in computing the net value there on line 5, then obviously there's going to be a mistake in computing the payout, and if that happens, there can be tax consequences. If you want ultimate guidance on this, a lot of it is found in the estate tax regulations, which obviously spend a great deal of time talking about valuations of assets for estate tax purposes. But here, the regulations under the foundation rules, and we don't have time to go into this in much detail, so if there are questions about this, please ask when we come back for lunch. But the law essentially differentiates between valuation of cash, marketable securities, non-marketable securities, real estate, certain unique assets, and that kind of thing. And I don't have time to take you through all the ins and outs, so again, if you want to ask questions, the timing part I mentioned, cash, marketable securities are usually valued monthly. Most other assets are valued annually. In some cases, real estate can be valued over using a 5-year evaluation. I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there. And again, if you want to ask more and need to have more information, we can talk about it in the session this afternoon.
Virginia.
Yep. This next slide piggybacks off what Bruce was just talking about, and it's just kind of an issue to remember from year to year. So again, we're talking about that minimum investment return and looking at the fair market value of your assets not used in carrying out your charitable purposes, because those are your investment assets that form the base of calculating that 5% payout. So there are times that you may have a charitable use asset, so it wasn't included in this calculation of the minimum investment return, but it becomes an investment asset. So an example of that might be, maybe you have an office building that was used for the foundation's purposes. Your offices were there, that's where you ran your foundation activities. Well, then you decided to move, but you decided to hold on to that office building and rent it out for investment purposes. That might be an example. Or maybe you had, there was a camp or some real estate that was used you allowed other charities to come on that property, use it for charitable purposes. And again, there's been a change in the use of that asset. You're now renting it out, or for whatever reason, it's now kind of more in your investment portfolio. You need to let your accountants or the return preparers know when there's been a change like that, because they may not otherwise pick up on that.
Okay, let's see. Not sure who had this one. I think the point of this slide was touched upon earlier, and that is that if a program-related investment is made, you'll see there on line 4, recoveries of amounts treated as qualifying distributions. So that is the possibility of a grant, a portion of a grant that was not fully expended by your grantee, and a portion of the grant was returned, or in the case of a program-related investment, when the investment matured and you were either repaid the loan or realized the sales proceeds from the disposition of an equity investment, then that would go into the computation of the distributable amount for that particular year.
And Jim, I might add that if you have one of these wonderful PRIs where you make an equity PRI and you make a lot more money than you think that you're going to make, all you have to add back in is the amount you originally treated as a qualifying distribution. You don't have to add back in, all the profits that you made as well.
Right. Bruce, I think this is yours?
Yes, this is mine, and these questions look pretty simple. The form is asking, the return is asking if the organization has engaged in any activities not previously reported, and the same thing about changes in its governing instruments, and the question is either yes or no, of course. Well, the concept here is that when the organization, the foundation, originally got its recognition of exemption, it disclosed all material facts to the IRS, got a favorable ruling. Now time goes by, there may be changes in the activities, changes in the instruments. My experience is that this happens a lot more in the public charity arena than in the private foundation area, but it can happen, obviously. And so the judgment call, again, has to be made, and I selfishly would encourage you to use legal counsel here, is whether these changes are material or immaterial. If they're immaterial, in my view, you don't have to answer the question yes. But if they are material, you do have to answer the question. And again, in my practice, some people think when these things happen, you either have to file a new application for recognition, which is not true, or you send a letter to the IRS and explaining it, and that's not true either. You do it here. And as you see, you attach a statement if there is a material change. Now, what I'm about to say is a little sensitive, and I don't want to offend any accountants here, and probably any accountants that are here would not engage in this practice anyway. But there are some times where these returns are prepared, and the accountant uses, or whoever prepares the return, uses what I call the Sally doctrine. You know, same as last year. The answer was, you know, answered no last year, so they just automatically answer it no this year. And so the years go by, and the entity changes materially in form, but every year the organization keeps saying no, no, no. Then the IRS comes in and sees a totally different entity than what it saw when it first ruled. So that's the situation you want to avoid. So that's the answer here. You make a judgment as to what changes in either category are material. If they are, you report it, explain it, and that's it.
Okay, we're going to have to go through quickly these the rest of these slides
quickly.
here.
Okay, so this is the part 7. This is the part that when people pull, unrelated to your organization, pull your 990 to look at it, they tend to go look at this because people love to know what other people make, and it's got a lot of good information on that. But the point we're trying to make here, though, is making sure that it makes sense. So this is the part you have to list out, you know, all the officers, directors, trustees, certain highly paid employees. Especially if you have like a family office situation or people that are splitting their time, you really need to be looking at this saying, well, how many hours are they really devoting to the position, and what are they getting paid to do that? Because you want them to be in sync. If they're getting well paid, then they should be devoting a significant amount of time to the position. And then the next, you want me to flip through to the next one, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you look at your volunteer directors, though, I can't tell you how many 990 PFs I'll look at, and public charity 990s as well. Well, they'll just put zeros for the directors. The directors spend 0 time each, because they think, well, week to week, they really don't do a lot. Well, but they do. And, you know, you have to think on average, what are they doing? So I hate seeing zeros there because it's just inaccurate and it doesn't look good. So, you know, correct answers may be 1 to 3 or 2 hours per week or 5 hours per week. And then some of your even though they're volunteers, you know, they may spend significant amounts of time. You may have an all-volunteer executive team, but they don't get paid because their services are being donated, again, maybe by the family office, maybe by a related for-profit company, but they're devoting significant time. So just thinking through that.
Okay, this one we can do very quickly. This is often done wrong by a private foundation, but I've never seen the IRS follow up. You'll see this is where you just identify the tax status, really, of your grantees. And you'll see there's one category, foundation status of recipient, and I frankly see 501c3 filled in most often, and that's it. So, you know, you can read the instructions, and I would encourage you to fill it out completely, but I would say that this is one of the areas where I think there's lots of, you know, less than fulsome information.
And I'll just make one comment, because while I was at Treasury, this was the topic of a question that I received from a private foundation that was very concerned about the direction to give the name and address of the recipients of grants, and they made a lot of scholarship grants to low-income children or high school graduating, you know, 17, 18-year-old kids, and thought it was not a good idea to list their full name and home address when they were giving them thousands of dollars in scholarship funds, and potentially really an intrusion on privacy. And so that was an issue that was raised. I don't think it's necessary. So have you seen this?
Well, I know that the Form 990 addresses this issue explicitly and makes it clear that if you're making grants for financial need, you know, or scholarships for financial need, or payments to grants to individuals, to indigents, you don't have to report their names. And I would suggest that that same rule should be applicable in the context of private foundations.
It isn't specifically addressed out there, but from a policy perspective, I got real queasy. We did not do specific guidance to address it, but I can tell you that it is something that would make people very uncomfortable, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. And if one of these days the 990 PF will be updated, you know, like the 990 was 10 years from now, and whenever that happens, they'll fix this problem.
Okay, this next slide, most foundations don't have unrelated business income, but if your foundation does, and that aggregates $1,000 or more, you have the obligation for filing a separate return, which is a 990T. It is the place where you report the amount of unrelated business income, and you compute the net income after expenses, and you compute the tax that is payable to the federal government with respect to that return. It is due the same time as the 990PF that Bruce mentioned, 15th day of the 5th month. If you want an extension, there is an extension form. Bruce mentioned this. It's the form 8868, but you have to file a separate form to request an extension on the 990T as well as the 990PF. You can't combine the two. The next slide, net operating losses. I'm going to skip over this because we're going to be talking a good bit more about net operating losses a bit later. Ruth, the 8283.
Okay, I'll just speak real briefly about the 8283 and its companion 8282. The 8283 is a form that donors need to fill out and attach to their returns if they are making contributions of non-cash gifts in excess of $500. There's a section for small gifts on the front and a section on the back for the larger gifts where the deductions are claimed of more than $5,000, and information about the donation, the donee and the donation are collected. If it is a contribution of more than $5,000, the back portion functions as an appraisal summary that typically when there's a contribution of more than $5,000, there needs to be an appraisal. You don't have to file it until you get over another threshold or in particular cases, but the summary on the back needs to be signed by the appraiser, and there's a section for the donee, the organization that receives it, to sign as well, and you can look at the instructions for that. Tip: keep a copy of the 8283 yourself, because if you dispose of the property that you got inside of 3 years, you have an obligation to file a Form 8282. And the information that's on the 8283 will be helpful to you when you're filing the 8282, or if you were to give away the property to another donee, to another organization like a public charity within that 3-year time period, you would need to give them a copy of the Form 8283 that the donor gave to you. So it's good to keep a copy of that when you see it and when you're asked to sign it, because they will need to get your signature. That's a great time to take a copy of it and not rely on them to get it back to you. There are a couple of exceptions I want to flip here quickly to the exceptions for filing the 8282. One of them is where the item was valued at $500 or less. The donor may have had to file an 8283 because they gave a whole bunch of items that aggregated to $500 or more. If you're disposing of an item valued at $500 or less, you don't have to do the 8282. And second, if the items are consumed or distributed for your charitable purpose, you also don't have to file the 8282, and that's in the instructions. And the last one.
Last slide.
Last slide is the Form 8940. It exists. It's a form that you use to request a couple of specific approvals, advance approval of a scholarship recipient procedures or terminations. It's also a handy form if you're making a grant to a grantee and their status is in question. After the Pension Protection Act, which made a distinction between different types of supporting organizations, it becomes important to know if this is a Type 1, Type 2, or Type 3 supporting organization if you want to make a grant to them. And so it impacts whether or not you can count it as a qualifying distribution or whether you have to use expenditure responsibility. If the organization was created and got their determination a long time ago, they may not have a specificity on their determination letter, and they can use this form to figure out what type of supporting organization they are, or if they have changed what they have done over the years, and you're looking at what they're doing now in their determination letter, and you're saying, I'm not sure that they still qualify as a hospital because I don't see a hospital. You might want them to use this form to get a redetermination of their private foundation status.
Anything else?
I was going to add, E can be important if you're making a large grant to a small charity that you're worried about tipping. If you have time, you can ask them to get a ruling that it's going to be treated as an unusual grant, and then you don't have to worry that they've now become a private foundation as well.
All right, with that, we're now adjourned for lunch. We'll take an hour. As Nicole told you, there's going to be both food up here under the tent as well as down in the main house, and we'll see you back here in an hour. Thank you. Okay, good.
Yeah. A lot to cover.
Sorry, I put more stuff on those slides. Right, questions already? Okay, good. Hey, Debbie, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, it's a real shame. It's a real shame. I think he got out of the hospital, I believe. All the lights are seeing stage lights, right? Typically, I want the foundation to take a look at the report and their composition and compensation